Somewhere in a government archive in London, there are files that have never been fully opened to the public. They contain the names of children, thousands upon thousands of names, children who were loaded onto ships and sent to the other side of the world before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. Children who were told, sometimes by nuns, sometimes by welfare officers, sometimes by the people who were supposed to be protecting them, that their mothers and fathers were dead, that there was no one left who wanted them, that Australia was their future now, and that the past did not exist anymore. Most of those children believed what they were told. They had no reason not to. They were 4 years old, or 7 or 10. They had already been taken from their homes and placed in institutions. They had already learned that adults had the power to move them without explanation. And so when the adults said their parents were gone, the children grieved quietly in the way that children grieve when no one teaches them how, and they got on the ships, and they crossed the ocean, and they arrived in a country they had never heard of, and they began the long work of surviving. What they did not know was that their parents were alive, that their mothers had written letters that were never delivered, that their fathers had turned up at the institutions asking where their children had gone and been turned away, that siblings had been separated onto different ships, sent to different parts of Australia, and would not see each other again for 40, 50, 60 years. That the system that had promised to care for them was, in many cases, using them as unpaid labor, subjecting them to conditions that the people running it would never have tolerated for their own children, and covering its tracks with bureaucratic language about welfare and opportunity and the building of empire. This is the story of the British child migration schemes. It is one of the longest running and most systematic forced migrations of children in modern history. It began in the Victorian era and continued with the full knowledge and financial support of both the British and Australian governments until 1970. And for most of that time, it was considered not a scandal but a public good. If you have found this channel because you are settling in for the night, or because you need something calm and steady to help you rest, you are welcome here. This is a long story, told slowly. There is no need to follow every detail. Let the words settle over you like something familiar. The history is real, and it deserves to be heard, but it does not need to be carried all at once. Before we go further, if this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling is what you come here for, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps this channel reach the people who need it, and it means you will always know when a new story is ready. Now, let us begin, slowly and properly, at the beginning. The first thing to understand is the scale of what happened and the length of time over which it happened, because both of those things are so large that the mind tends to resist them. Between approximately 1869 and 1970, somewhere between 130,000 and 150,000 children were sent from Britain to Australia, Canada, Rhodesia, New Zealand, and South Africa under various child migration schemes. The Australian component of this was the largest and the longest running. Over the course of roughly a century, tens of thousands of children made the voyage from Britain to Australia under programs organised by charities, religious organisations and government bodies, with the explicit financial backing of both governments. The number 150,000 is not an estimate that anyone disputes in its broad form. What is disputed, and what has never been fully resolved, is the exact breakdown of how many went where, under which scheme, at which point in history, and what happened to them after they arrived. The record keeping was inconsistent at best and deliberately obscured at worst. Many of the organisations involved destroyed their records or denied that certain children had ever been in their care. Many of the children themselves never knew which organisation had sent them, or under what legal authority they had been moved. What this means in practical terms is that, for many of the survivors, the search for identity has been a lifelong project. They do not know where they were born. They do not know their parents' names. In some cases, they do not know their original surname, because names were changed when children arrived at institutions, sometimes to make administration easier, sometimes to prevent parents from tracing them. A child who left Southampton as Thomas Hendricks might have arrived in Western Australia as Tom Harris. The new name was the only name anyone in Australia knew. The old name existed only in files that might or might not have survived. The scale of the program also means that its effects did not end when the last ship docked. The children who were sent to Australia in the 1950s and 1960s grew up and had children of their own, and those children grew up not knowing their own heritage, their own grandparents, their own family medical histories. The wound spread outward, generation by generation, in ways that the architects of the scheme never bothered to calculate, because the welfare of the children was never, in the end, the primary consideration. The primary consideration was elsewhere, and it had very little to do with the children themselves. The programs operated under different names at different times. The Fairbridge Society, the Big Brother movement, the Catholic Episcopal Migration and Welfare Association, the Northcote Children's Farm, Dr. Barnardo's Homes, the Church of England's migration schemes, the Salvation Army. Each organization had its own recruitment methods, its own institutions in Australia, its own relationships with the British and Australian governments, and its own culture, which ranged from merely inadequate to genuinely brutal, but they all shared the same basic premise: that British children, specifically children who were poor or illegitimate or orphaned or simply inconvenient to their families, were a resource that could be used to populate the empire. The language of the era described it as giving children a fresh start, a new life in a new land, the sunshine and open air of Australia, as opposed to the cramped slums of British cities, the opportunity to grow up strong and capable, far from the poverty and moral contamination of the urban poor. It was the language of charity and optimism, and it concealed, quite deliberately, the reality of what was actually being done and why. The children who arrived first, in the Victorian era, entered an Australia that was still being settled in its inland regions, where land was vast and labour was short. The premium placed on young bodies capable of physical work was explicit in the early justifications for the schemes. The children were supply meeting demand. As Australia developed and as its economy diversified, the form of the demand changed, but the basic transaction did not. There was always a use for the children, and the use was never primarily their own flourishing. The timeline of the schemes spans periods of enormous change in both Britain and Australia. Children were sent during the Boer War era, during the Great War, during the Depression, during the Second World War, during the post-war Reconstruction period, and into the era of television and the welfare state. The social context changed enormously. The understanding of child psychology and child welfare deepened enormously. The legal frameworks governing the treatment of children in care evolved, and yet the schemes continued with government support and charitable participation until 1970, adapting to new contexts without fundamentally changing their character. The persistence of the schemes across a century of social change is itself evidence that their continuation served interests that were not primarily about the welfare of children. The children who were targeted by the migration schemes were not randomly selected. They came from specific circumstances, and understanding those circumstances tells you a great deal about the priorities of the people running the programs and the society that permitted them to operate for as long as they did. The largest single category was children who were in institutional care in Britain. This included children whose parents had died, but it also included a much larger group whose parents were alive but who had been assessed by the welfare standards of the time as unable to provide adequate care. A mother who had a child outside of marriage might find that child taken into care if she could not demonstrate financial stability. A family that fell into poverty and could not maintain a home might have its children removed. A father who was imprisoned or a mother who was ill might find that the state had taken over the care of the children in a very permanent way. The assumption built into the system was that children in institutional care were, by definition, available for redistribution. They were wards of various charities or local authorities. They did not have effective parental advocates. The adults who were supposed to be looking out for them were the same adults who were deciding to send them abroad. And the financial incentives aligned in one direction. Sending a child to Australia was cheaper than keeping a child in a British institution for the next decade. The second major category was children recruited directly from poor families, often with the explicit or implied consent of parents who had been led to believe that emigration represented a genuine opportunity. These families were told that their children would receive education and training, that they would grow up in healthy conditions, that they would have access to land and work, and that they would be able to maintain contact with their families in Britain. Almost none of these promises were consistently kept. In many cases, none of them were kept at all. The class dynamics of the scheme cannot be separated from its history. The children who were sent were overwhelmingly working class. The people who designed and administered the scheme were overwhelmingly middle and upper class. The language used to describe the children in the internal documents of the charities and in the correspondence between the British and Australian governments was the language of the era's class prejudices. Children from poor backgrounds were described as potential labor, as raw material, as useful human stock. The question of whether they had inner lives or attachments or a right to know where they came from was not seriously engaged. There was also a racial dimension that the Australian side of the scheme was quite explicit about. Australia had, since Federation, operated a white Australia policy that restricted non-European immigration. The child migration schemes were seen, on the Australian side, as a way of increasing the white population of the continent without admitting adult immigrants who might have economic or political demands. Children were preferred over adults partly because they were cheaper to process, partly because they could be shaped into the workforce that was needed, and partly because they could not argue back. An organisation as large as the Catholic Church or the Fairbridge Society could make a coherent argument to both governments that it was performing a public service by supplying Australia with exactly the kind of population Australia wanted. The geography of British poverty shaped the geography of the schemes. Many of the children came from industrial cities in the north of England: Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, and Scotland. They came from the slums that had grown up around the factories and the docks and the mines. They were the children of people who had come to those cities looking for work during the industrialization of the previous century, and who had found work, but who had also found poverty, overcrowding, disease, and a welfare system that was just beginning to develop the structures we now associate with it. Some children came from rural areas, from farm labouring families in the south of England, who had fallen on hard times as agricultural employment contracted. Some came from Ireland, from families whose poverty had different roots but whose circumstances were similar. The diversity of origins within the group labelled British child migrants is worth emphasising because it complicates any simple narrative. These were not a homogeneous population with a single story. There were thousands of individual children, each with a specific history, a specific family, a specific set of circumstances that had brought them to the point of being sent across the world. The lie told to parents is one of the most persistent and painful threads in the entire history of the child migration schemes, and it takes several different forms depending on the time period and the organisation involved. In the earliest phase of the schemes, during the Victorian era, the relationship between the charities and the parents of the children was often simply adversarial. The charities had legal custody of the children, the parents did not, and the charities felt no obligation to inform parents of what they were doing with the children in their care. A parent who had handed a child to a charity during a period of financial crisis, or whose child had been removed by welfare authorities, might simply find that the child had been sent abroad when they came to try to reconnect. There was no notification, there was no consent sought, there was no appeal process. The child was a ward of the charity, and the charity could do as it chose. As the 20th century progressed, the legal and social frameworks changed somewhat, but the practical reality remained largely the same. Some organizations made nominal attempts to inform parents or to obtain consent, but the definition of informed consent that these organizations applied was extremely loose. A parent might be told that their child was being considered for emigration and asked to sign a form, but the form might not explain what emigration actually meant in practical terms. It might not explain that contact would be difficult or impossible. It might not explain that the child was being sent to a labor institution rather than a family placement. The parents signed because they trusted the charity, or because they had no real alternative, or because the social pressure in the room made refusal feel impossible. In other cases, there was simply deception. Parents who inquired about their children after signing forms were told that the children had already left, or that contact was not possible for the children's own well-being, or that the children themselves had expressed no desire to maintain contact. Some parents were told their children had died in Australia, when in fact the children were alive and working on farms or in institutions, writing letters that were being intercepted and destroyed. The letters are a particular cruelty within the larger cruelty. Many of the children who were sent abroad wrote to their parents repeatedly over years. They gave the letters to the adults in charge of their institutions, believing they would be posted. Many were not. The children did not know this. They believed their parents were not writing back. Some concluded that their parents did not care. Some concluded that their parents had indeed died. The belief that they had been abandoned, rather than that the communication had been deliberately suppressed, was enormously damaging to the children's sense of themselves and their place in the world. On the parents' side, the same process operated in reverse. Mothers and fathers who tried to trace their children through the charities were frequently told that the child had been placed in a good home, and that further contact would be disruptive to the child's adjustment. Some were told the organization had no record of the child in question, even when the child was alive and in institutional care under the organization's administration. Some were told their children had died when the children were very much alive. The effect of these sustained deceptions, maintained over years and sometimes over decades, was to sever the family relationships that might otherwise have provided a route back to each other. By the time the Australian and British governments began, in the 1990s and 2000s, to acknowledge what had happened and to try to help survivors trace their families, many of the parents had died. The reunions that happened too late in many cases, for the relationships to be what they might have been. People who should have grown up knowing each other met as strangers in the 60s and 70s, trying to reconstruct from what remained a connection that had been taken from them before they had a chance to understand what it meant. The bureaucratic language in which these deceptions were conducted is one of its more disturbing features. The letters that charities sent to inquiring parents were not written by people who appeared to understand themselves as engaged in deception. They were written in the measured, professional language of social welfare administration. They expressed concern for the child's well-being. They invoked the child's best interests. They used the vocabulary of care and protection to perform the opposite of care and protection. The gap between the language and the reality it described is something that recurs throughout the records of this period, and it is a reminder of how effectively institutional language can insulate those who use it from the human consequences of what they're doing. The lie told to the children themselves was, in some ways, even more total and even more damaging than the lie told to their parents, because the children had no framework within which to question it. They were too young, too isolated, and too dependent on the adults around them to be able to maintain any independent version of their own history against the version they were given. The most direct form of the lie was the statement that one or both parents were dead. This was told to children of all ages in institutions across Australia by figures of authority who the children had been taught to trust and obey. A nun who told a 6-year-old that his mother was dead was not someone that child had any mechanism for disbelieving. The statement was delivered with the authority of the church, the authority of the institution, the authority of adulthood itself. And the child, who had no access to any other source of information, had no choice but to grieve and move on. The related lie told in slightly different circumstances was that the parents had not wanted the child, that the child had been given up willingly, that the family in Britain had chosen to send the child away and had no interest in maintaining contact. This lie was in some ways even more damaging than the lie about death, because death is something that can be accepted and mourned. The belief that one's parents had chosen to abandon one, that one was simply not wanted, created a different kind of wound, one that affected how children understood their own value and their own place in the world. Beyond the explicit lies about family, there was also a more pervasive and structural form of deception built into the children's daily experience. The children were given new names, or their existing names were simplified or altered, in ways that made tracing them more difficult. They were told very little about where they had come from. In some institutions, discussing one's origins in England was discouraged or prohibited. The past was not a resource the children were allowed to draw on. The institution was their world now, and questions about what had come before were not encouraged. Some children were not told they were British at all. They were simply told they were Australian, and they grew up not knowing that there was a country on the other side of the world where records of their birth existed, where siblings and parents and cousins had gone on living without them. The discovery in adult life that one was not who one had been told one was, that one had an original name and an original family and an original history that had been concealed, was for many survivors one of the most disorienting experiences of their lives. The psychological literature on identity formation makes clear how fundamental a sense of origin is to a child's development. Knowing where one comes from, having a narrative that connects the present self to a past self and to the people from whom that self emerged, is not a luxury or a supplement to normal development. It is part of the foundation on which a stable sense of self is built. The children who were told their parents were dead, or who were given new names, or who were prevented from discussing their origins, were being robbed of this foundation at the most vulnerable period of their development. The consequences followed many of them for the rest of their lives, in patterns of attachment difficulty, identity confusion, depression, and a kind of permanent low-level grief that many described as simply the weather of their interior life, something they had always lived with and had never quite found a name for. There were children who resisted the institutional narrative, who held onto a private version of their own history against the version that was imposed on them. These children clung to fragments, a memory of a smell, a face seen through the window of a car on a street in England, the sound of a name spoken in a particular accent, a physical object that had traveled with them on the ship. The fragments were not enough to reconstruct a full history, but they were enough to maintain the conviction that a history existed, that the version they were being given was incomplete. For some of these children, those fragments were what made the later search possible. The voyage itself deserves its own place in this history, because for many of the children, it was one of the last moments before the full weight of what was happening became impossible to avoid. The ships that carried the children to Australia left from ports in England and Scotland, most often Southampton, and the journey to Australia in the early and middle decades of the 20th century took several weeks. Children travelled in groups, supervised by adults from the sending organisations. The conditions on the ships varied considerably depending on the era, the organisation, and the class of accommodation. But a consistent feature of the accounts that survivors have given is the combination of excitement and terror, the sense of movement and change so total that the mind could not quite hold it. For the youngest children, those who were 3 or 4 years old, the voyage was simply bewildering. They had no understanding of where they were going or what it meant. They had been removed from one environment and placed in another, and the ship was simply the next environment, with its rhythms of meals and sleeping and the perpetual sound and motion of the sea. These children often formed the closest attachments to slightly older children during the voyage, and the separation from those companions on arrival, when children were distributed to different institutions, added another layer of loss to what was already an overwhelming accumulation of displacement. For older children, those who were 7 or 8 or 10, the voyage was marked by a more conscious awareness of what was being left behind. Some of these children had genuine memories of their families, of specific places and specific faces, and the increasing distance from those places and faces as the ship moved south and then east was something they felt as a physical sensation. Several survivors have described the moment of losing sight of land as one of the most sharply remembered experiences of their childhood. The visual confirmation that there was no way back. The adults supervising the voyages were, by most accounts, neither cruel nor particularly kind. They were administrators tasked with delivering a consignment of children safely to their destination, and their relationships with the children tended toward the functional rather than the warm. Some children formed genuine attachments to specific supervisors and were devastated when those supervisors handed them over on arrival and left. Others experienced the voyage as simply a suspension, a period of waiting in which nothing was real and nothing needed to be felt quite yet. The arrival in Australia, most often in Fremantle in Western Australia or in Sydney, was frequently described by survivors as the moment when the reality of the situation began to become clear. The light was different. The air smelled different. The land, visible from the ship as something vast and flat and golden, was not like anything they had imagined. And the adults waiting on the dock to receive them were strangers, who looked at them the way a farmer looks at an incoming shipment of something practical. The children were processed on arrival. They were checked for health and administered to and allocated to their various destinations. Brothers and sisters who had traveled together were sometimes separated at this point, sent to different institutions in different parts of the country. The separations were done efficiently and with minimal explanation. The children who were separated did not always understand in the moment that the separation was permanent. Some believed they would be reunited soon. Some waited for reunions that never came. On the dock at Fremantle, or on the quayside at Sydney, the children who had just arrived were entering a new country and a new life that nobody had asked their opinion about. They were wearing their institutional clothes. They were carrying whatever small possessions had survived the voyage. They were standing in light and heat that was unlike anything they had known in Britain, in the company of adults who were strangers, about to be taken to places they had never heard of. They did not know that this was a beginning they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. The Fairbridge Society is one of the most well-known organisations involved in the migration of children to Australia, and it is useful as a case study, both because its records are relatively well preserved and because the gap between its stated ideals and its actual practice is so starkly documented. Kingsley Fairbridge was a Rhodesian-born man who studied at Oxford at the beginning of the 20th century and developed, in the early years of his adult life, a plan to solve what he saw as two problems simultaneously: the overcrowding of Britain's urban poor and the underpopulation of the British Empire's territories in the southern hemisphere. His solution was child migration. He proposed to take children from the slums and institutions of Britain and bring them to farm schools in Australia, Canada, and Rhodesia, where they would be trained in agricultural labour and become the productive rural population that the empire needed. Fairbridge's vision was, by the standards of his time, idealistic in its stated aims. He genuinely believed that the children he was sending would benefit from the program, and the farm school model he proposed was at least superficially more humane than the pure labour extraction that characterised some other organisations. The children at Fairbridge farm schools were supposed to live in cottages with house mothers, attend school, receive vocational training, and eventually move into independent employment. The gap between the model and the reality was substantial. The farm school at Pinjarra in Western Australia, which was the flagship Fairbridge institution in Australia, functioned less like the nurturing educational community of Fairbridge's vision, and more like a labour institution where children worked long hours, received minimal formal education, and existed in conditions that many of them described in later life as harsh, isolated, and emotionally barren. The house mothers, who were supposed to provide the family-style care that gave the cottage system its rationale, were a mixed group. Some were genuinely caring. Others were cold, authoritarian, or abusive. The children had no mechanism for removing themselves from the care of a bad house mother, and the institution's management was not consistently responsive to complaints. Children who raised concerns about their treatment were sometimes punished rather than helped, on the grounds that complaint was a form of ingratitude. The education provided at Pinjarra was consistently described by survivors as minimal. Boys were trained for farm labour and domestic service. Girls were trained for domestic service. The curriculum did not extend to the kind of academic preparation that might have given these children the same opportunities as their Australian-born contemporaries. The effect was to lock children into a narrow range of possible futures, not because their abilities were limited, but because the institution had decided in advance what kind of adults they were going to become. The Fairbridge Society continued to operate in Australia until the early 1970s, and it continued to send children from Britain until 1967. During that entire period, the question of whether the children would have been better served by remaining in Britain or by being placed in family homes rather than institutions was never seriously addressed. The institution was self-perpetuating. It needed children to function, and it received government funding on the basis of the children it processed. The interests of the institution and the interests of the children it housed were not the same interests, and when they conflicted, the institution's interests generally prevailed. The survivors of the Fairbridge system are, as a group, among the more organised and articulate in the child migrant survivor community, partly because the Fairbridge model was distinctive enough that it created a shared identity among those who passed through it, and partly because the relatively good records of the Fairbridge Society made it easier for survivors to trace their institutional histories. The Old Fairbridgians Association has been an important vehicle for survivor advocacy and mutual support, and the testimony of its members has been central to the public record of what life in the Fairbridge system was actually like. The Christian Brothers operated several institutions in Western Australia that became in later years the subject of some of the most serious abuse allegations in the entire history of the child migration schemes. The most notorious of these was Bindoon, formerly known as Bindoon Boys Town, which operated from 1936 and housed boys sent from Britain and Ireland, as well as local children from various backgrounds. Bindoon was built in significant part by the labour of the children who lived there. The brothers who ran the institution used the boys as a construction workforce, having them mix cement, lay bricks, and build the structures that would house subsequent generations of children. The boys were not paid for this labor, they were not given a choice about whether to perform it. And while performing it, they were subjected to conditions, including inadequate food, minimal clothing, and exposure to physical danger that would be recognized as child labor exploitation by any contemporary standard. The building program at Bindoon was presented by the Christian Brothers and by the organizations that sent children there as vocational training. Boys were learning construction skills, the argument went. They were being given practical knowledge that would serve them in later life. The Australian and British governments, both of which provided funding to the institution, and both of which sent inspectors from time to time, accepted this argument. The inspection reports that have survived describe Bindoon in generally positive terms. They note that the buildings are impressive. They note that the boys appear healthy. They do not note in any consistent way the conditions under which the buildings were produced. The physical abuse at Bindoon and other Christian Brothers institutions in Western Australia was extensive and well documented by the time the survivors began speaking publicly in the late 1980s and 1990s. Boys were beaten regularly, sometimes with implements, often for minor infractions of institutional rules. The culture of physical punishment was so normalized within the institution that many of the boys who experienced it did not immediately recognize it as abuse. It was simply the way things were. The concept that an adult was not permitted to beat a child was not one that Bindoon communicated to its residents. The sexual abuse at Bindoon was also extensive. Multiple survivors have given consistent, detailed accounts of abuse by members of the Christian Brothers at this institution and at other Brothers-run institutions in Western Australia. The pattern of abuse, as reconstructed from survivor testimony and from internal records that became available during later inquiries, was systematic rather than opportunistic. Children were targeted by individual brothers, and the institutional culture was one that protected abusers rather than victims. Children who complained were told they were lying or were punished or were subjected to additional abuse as a response to their complaint. The Christian Brothers as an organization were aware, over many decades, that abuse was occurring in their Australian institutions. This is established by internal correspondence that was not fully available to the public until the late 1990s and early 2000s. The organizational response to known abuse was not to report it to civil authorities or to remove abusers from contact with children. It was to move abusers to different institutions where they had access to different children while maintaining the silence that protected the organization's reputation. The British and Australian governments, both of which had a direct relationship with these institutions as funders and as senders of children, bear a share of responsibility for what happened within them. Both governments conducted inspections that were inadequate. Both governments received funding requests from these institutions and approved them without conducting the kind of rigorous oversight that the welfare of children in care required. The institutional culture of trust in religious organizations, combined with a reluctance to interfere in what was seen as charitable work, created conditions in which abuse could be sustained for decades without any external check. Beyond Bindoon, the network of Catholic institutions in Western Australia included Castledare, Clontarf, and Tartan, as well as institutions run by the Sisters of Mercy and other orders for girls. Each of these institutions had its own character and its own history, but they shared certain structural features that made them environments where children's welfare was, at minimum, not consistently prioritized. Castledare, which was run by the Christian Brothers near Perth, housed younger boys, many of them quite small when they arrived. The institution's records show that it received children from Britain who were as young as 5 and 6 years old, transported across the world and placed in the care of a religious order in a country they had never seen, without their parents' knowledge or consent in many cases. The brothers at Castledare were not uniformly abusive, and some former residents described specific brothers with genuine affection, but the institutional structure was one in which children had no effective advocate, no route to external help, and no language for describing what was wrong with their situation, even when something was seriously wrong. The girls' institutions present a somewhat different history, in part because the literature of survivor testimony for girls' institutions is less developed than for boys, and in part because the specific vulnerabilities of girls in institutional care are different from those of boys. The Sisters of Mercy ran institutions in Western Australia that housed British migrant girls alongside local children, and the accounts that have emerged from these institutions describe a regime that was austere, physically demanding, and emotionally cold, with corporal punishment used as a disciplinary tool and with strict controls over the girls' movements, relationships, and access to information about their own histories. Girls in these institutions were trained almost exclusively for domestic service. The expectation was clear and it was enforced. A girl who grew up in a Sisters of Mercy institution was being prepared to work as a servant in a middle-class Australian household. The academic education provided was minimal. The vocational training was specific and narrow, and the relational skills needed for autonomous adult life were not developed because the institutions did not want autonomous adults. They wanted compliant domestic workers, and that is what many of the girls who passed through them became. The Northcote Children's Farm in Victoria operated under the auspices of the Women's Migration and Overseas Appointment Society and housed girls and young women sent from Britain. The farm's stated purpose was to train girls in rural domestic skills, and its records show a somewhat different culture from the Western Australian Catholic institutions, one that was less physically brutal, but still characterized by the same fundamental indifference to the girls' own wishes and the same failure to maintain meaningful contact with their families in Britain. Tardan, in the wheat belt of Western Australia, was another Christian Brothers institution that housed older boys, many of them teenagers when they arrived. Tardan was an agricultural institution, and the boys there worked the land as their primary activity. The combination of isolation, physical labor, and institutional authority created conditions that many survivors described as something close to confinement. Boys were not free to leave. The nearest town was many kilometers away. Contact with the outside world was controlled and minimal, and the brothers who ran the institution had effectively total authority over every aspect of the boys' lives. Clontarf, also run by the Christian Brothers in Western Australia, was another institution for boys that produced a substantial body of survivor testimony about physical and other abuse. The institutional network of the Christian Brothers in Western Australia was, in effect, a system within a system, sharing personnel, sharing culture, and sharing the organizational protections that prevented abuse from being reported or addressed. The variety of institutions involved in the child migration schemes is important to acknowledge, because it complicates any simple narrative of a uniform experience. The institutions range from the relatively benign to the genuinely brutal, and the children who passed through them had correspondingly varied experiences. But the structural features that enabled abuse, inadequate oversight, institutional protection of authority figures over children, denial of family connection and identity information, and the absence of effective complaints mechanisms were present across the range, even in institutions where the worst abuses did not occur. The work conditions that children faced in the Australian institutions run by these various organisations were, by any reasonable modern standard, exploitative. Children performed labour that was economically valuable to the institutions and to the wider economy, and they performed it without compensation, without meaningful protection, and without any of the safeguards that would apply to adult workers in the same period. At Bindun, as already noted, boys built the institution's physical infrastructure, but the labour extended beyond construction. Boys at agricultural institutions throughout Western Australia and other states worked long hours in the fields, tending crops, managing livestock, maintaining fences and irrigation systems, and performing the full range of tasks associated with commercial farming operations. This was not light, educational work designed to give children an introduction to rural life. It was the same work that paid adult farmhands would have performed, done by children as young as 10 or 11, often before school, often after school, and on weekends and during school holidays without any reduction in workload. The hours of labour were not formally documented in the way that employment records would be. The institutions described the work as part of training or as contributing to the life of the community. But survivor accounts are consistent in describing working days that began very early, often before dawn for milking or before sunrise for field work, and that extended into the afternoon or evening. A boy at an agricultural institution might spend 8 or 9 hours performing physical labor before being expected to attend the evening meal and prayers and lights out routine. For girls, the labor took different forms, but was equally uncompensated and equally demanding. Girls performed all the domestic work of the institutions they lived in: cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare for younger children, sewing and mending, garden work, and in some institutions, work in the institution's commercial laundry or kitchen facilities. A girl who left institutional care at 16 and went into domestic service was, in practice, simply continuing the same work she'd been performing for free, but now in a situation where she received a very small wage. The placement of children into domestic service directly from institutions is one of the clearest illustrations of the economic function that the migration scheme served. The Australian households that employed these children received labour at very low cost. The children themselves had no alternative, no network of family or community support that might have helped them negotiate better terms, and no legal protections beyond the minimal ones that existed in Australian labour law of the period. They were, in effect, a supply of controlled, domesticated labour delivered to the Australian economy by a system that the British and Australian governments had jointly funded and jointly managed. The fact that the work was sometimes characterized as educational or developmental does not alter this analysis. The test of whether work is educational or exploitative is not how it is described by the people who benefit from it. The test is whether the children performing it are developing skills and knowledge that genuinely expand their future options, or whether they are performing tasks that primarily benefit the institution or the employer, and that foreclose rather than expand the range of lives available to them. By that test, the work performed by child migrants in Australian institutions was, in very many cases, exploitation. The economic benefits that flowed from this arrangement went primarily to the institutions, the agricultural operations that used older children's labor, and the domestic employers who hired girls on placement. The children themselves received, in return for years of labor, a narrow vocational preparation for a narrow range of futures, conducted in conditions of emotional deprivation and, in many cases, physical danger. There is a particular irony in the fact that many of the buildings and farms and rural properties that were developed with child migrant labor in Western Australia and elsewhere became, in later decades, valuable assets. The labor that built them was never compensated. The children who performed it received nothing for it. The physical legacy of their work stands in the landscape, productive and solid, while the human legacy of the conditions in which it was performed continues to express itself in the lives of the people who survived those conditions. The physical abuse experienced by children in Australian institutions is documented in survivor testimony, in evidence presented to parliamentary inquiries, and in institutional records that became available as those inquiries proceeded. It was not uniform across all institutions, but it was widespread enough that it cannot be attributed to the actions of a few bad individuals. It was structural, embedded in institutional cultures that permitted and in some cases encouraged the use of physical force as a disciplinary mechanism. The forms of physical abuse described by survivors include beatings with hands, belts, straps, canes, and other implements, forcing children to maintain painful physical positions for extended periods, withholding food as punishment, and confinement in solitary conditions. The context for these punishments range from serious behavioral infractions to trivial breaches of institutional rules, to the simple personal displeasure of an authority figure, to accidents and mistakes that children had no ability to avoid. A child who wet the bed might be beaten. A child who spoke out of turn might be beaten. A child who was slow at a task might be beaten. The unpredictability of the punishment regime was, for many children, as damaging as the individual incidents of violence, because it created an environment of perpetual anxiety in which normal childhood behavior was never fully safe. The adults who administered this abuse were, in many cases, members of religious orders who genuinely believed that physical discipline was an appropriate and even necessary part of raising children. The cultural and religious frameworks within which they operated provided sanction for the use of physical force in ways that would not be recognized today. But cultural context does not eliminate harm. The children who were beaten regularly over years carried the effects of that treatment into their adult lives, in the form of anxiety disorders, difficulty with authority, hypervigilance, and an embodied sense that the world was a place where one could be hurt without warning. Some of the abuse went beyond the range that could be explained even by contemporary disciplinary norms. Multiple survivor accounts describe violence of an intensity and duration that had no plausible disciplinary purpose, that was clearly an expression of something other than a desire to correct behavior. Children who witnessed or experienced this kind of abuse often describe a sense of absolute helplessness, of being in the power of someone who could do anything to them with no consequence. That is among the most psychologically damaging experiences a child can have. The response of the institutions to internal knowledge of abuse was, as already noted, to protect the institution rather than the child. When inspectors from the British or Australian governments visited institutions and observed signs that something was wrong, the default response was to accept the institution's explanations and move on. The children were not interviewed privately. The children's perspectives were not sought. The assumption was that the adults running the institutions were competent and honest, and the evidence was interpreted through that assumption rather than against it. There is something particularly painful about the inspection records that survive from these institutions. A government inspector who visited Bindun and wrote a report describing the buildings as impressive and the boys as appearing well was, in the most literal sense, looking at the products of forced child labor and narrating them as evidence of a good outcome. The buildings were built by the children. Their impressiveness was a function of the labor that had produced them. The inspector did not ask how the buildings came to be. The inspector did not ask the boys what it had been like to build them. The inspection was, in practice, a process of official endorsement for a system that was causing ongoing harm. The physical marks of institutional abuse did not, for the most part, become visible in the public record during the period when the schemes were operating. Children who carried bruises or injuries could be managed within institutional settings. The medical care provided to children in these institutions was, in many cases, provided by practitioners who had a relationship with the institution and who were not independent of it. The mechanisms for independent reporting of child abuse that now exist were not present in the Australia of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. What happened in the institutions stayed in the institutions, by design and by circumstance. The sexual abuse of children in these institutions is the aspect of their history that received the most public attention during the inquiry period of the 1990s and 2000s, and it is also the aspect that was most systematically suppressed and concealed for most of the period during which the institutions operated. The accounts given by survivors of sexual abuse in the Australian child migrant institutions are consistent in ways that are difficult to attribute to anything other than direct experience. They describe specific places, specific individuals, specific routines of approach and access. They describe the isolation that preceded the abuse, the threats or inducements used to maintain silence, the fear and shame that prevented children from speaking. They describe institutional responses to disclosure that range from disbelief to punishment to additional abuse. And they describe the long-term effects of these experiences on their adult relationships, their capacity for intimacy, their ability to trust, their sense of their own bodies and their own worth. The perpetrators in many of these accounts are members of the religious orders that ran the institutions. This is not a statement about religious life in general or about the majority of those who devoted their lives to religious service. It is a statement about specific individuals who were placed in positions of authority over children without adequate oversight and who abused that authority in the worst possible ways. The institutional structures that enable this abuse are what need to be understood, because those structures were not accidental. They were built from decisions about oversight, accountability, and the relative credibility of children versus adult authority figures. A child in an institution who was sexually abused by a brother or a nun had, in practical terms, almost no effective recourse. The child could tell another adult at the institution, but the adults at the institution were colleagues of the abuser and had institutional incentives to disbelieve the child. The child could try to tell someone outside the institution, but the children had very limited contact with people outside the institution. The child could remain silent, which is what the majority did, because silence was the only response that did not carry a risk of making the situation worse. The organizations that ran these institutions knew, over many years, that sexual abuse was occurring. This is established not by inference but by documentary evidence. Internal correspondence within the Christian Brothers shows that allegations against specific individuals were received, documented, and handled by organizational leadership in ways that prioritize the protection of the organization over the protection of children. Individuals known to have abused children were transferred to different institutions. In some cases, they were sent back to Britain out of the reach of Australian authorities. In other cases, they were simply moved to a different facility where they had access to a different set of children. The children who were abused and who grew up carrying that experience in silence often did not find language for what had happened to them until the survivor movement of the late 20th century began to create a public discourse about childhood sexual abuse that made it possible to name. Many survivors describe spending decades in a state of confusion and distress about experiences they could not categorize because the categories did not publicly exist. When the categories became available and when the testimonies of other survivors confirmed that what had happened to them was real and was widespread, many felt a complex combination of relief and grief. Relief that they were not alone, grief for all the years they had carried the experience alone when they had not needed to. The scale of the sexual abuse that occurred in these institutions, when it finally became public knowledge, was genuinely shocking to many Australians and Britons who had accepted the narrative of the schemes as charitable and beneficial. The distance between that narrative and the reality of what had happened in the institutions, under the official sanctioning of both governments, was a distance that produced, in some quarters, a refusal of belief that the survivor advocacy organizations had to work consistently to overcome. The experience of girls in the child migration schemes has received less sustained attention in the historical record than the experience of boys, and the specific vulnerabilities of girls were different and in some ways harder to document. Girls who were migrated to Australia under these schemes faced all of the losses that boys faced: separation from family, a new country, institutional care, denial of educational opportunity, and in many cases physical abuse. But they also faced additional vulnerabilities specific to their gender, in an era and in institutions where girls and women were expected to be compliant and where their sexuality and reproductive capacity were the subject of institutional anxiety. The institutions that housed girls were often run by religious orders of women, and the culture of these institutions, while not uniformly abusive, was frequently characterized by a cold severity that seemed to express an ambivalence about the girls in their care. Girls were subjected to detailed supervision of their physical development and behavior in ways that reflected adult anxieties about female sexuality. Menstruation was discussed in terms of shame and danger. Contact with boys was prohibited and surveilled. The bodies of the girls were treated as potential problems to be managed rather than as natural facts of growing up. Some girls in these institutions were subjected to sexual abuse by the adults responsible for their care. The documentation of this abuse is less complete than the documentation of abuse in boys' institutions, in part because the girls who experienced it faced even greater barriers to disclosure. The culture of shame around female sexuality that characterized these institutions made it exceptionally difficult for a girl to find language to describe what was being done to her. When girls reached their mid-teens, the issue of placement into domestic service arose, and this transition itself carried specific risks. A girl who left an institution at 15 or 16 and entered a private household as a domestic servant had even less protection than she had had in the institution. She was in the private home of an employer she had not chosen, far from any institutional support or oversight, with no effective recourse if the household proved unsafe. The histories of child migrants include cases of girls who were sexually exploited by the employers into whom they were placed, with no institutional follow-up or support. The reproductive histories of some migrant girls are among the most poignant aspects of this history. Girls who became pregnant, whether as a result of consensual relationships or of abuse, were subject to the full weight of the moral disapproval of the era's institutions. Babies born to unmarried migrant girls were sometimes taken from them and adopted. The girls were told that this was for the best, that they were not able to care for a child, that the child would be better placed elsewhere. The parallels with the stories of their own mothers, who in many cases had been separated from them in exactly these terms, were not acknowledged. The women who survived these experiences, and who eventually found their way to the survivor movement, often describe a layered grief. Grief for the original separation from family, grief for what they experienced in the institutions, and grief for the secondary separations and losses that flowed from those experiences into the next generation. The identity theft that was built into the migration schemes is something that requires some effort to fully appreciate in its human implications. When a child is given a new name on arrival at an institution, what happens is this. The child who existed before with a specific family history, a specific place of birth, specific parents, specific siblings, begins to become inaccessible. The new name is what the institution uses. The new name is what goes into the institution's records. If the child's records are later consulted by a researcher or by the child themselves trying to reconstruct their history, the name they find is the new name, not the original one. The thread that connects them to their original identity is severed in administrative terms, and severed administrative threads are very difficult to reattach. The name changes were not always complete. In some cases, children kept their given names but had their surnames altered. In others, first names were anglicized or simplified. A name that sounded too working class or too Irish or too obviously connected to a specific family might be smoothed into something more generically acceptable. These changes were usually made without the child's knowledge or consent and were never communicated to the child's family in Britain. Beyond names, the information that was suppressed or altered extended to birth dates, birthplaces, and parentage. Some children were given incorrect birth dates in their institutional records, whether through careless record keeping or deliberate falsification. Some were listed as having been born in Australia when they had been born in Britain. Some were listed as having unknown parentage when the parentage was in fact known to the organization that had sent them. This systematic corruption of the historical record made it very difficult, decades later, for survivors to establish their identities for legal and administrative purposes. The practical consequences of not knowing one's identity were significant and lasting. Survivors trying to access medical care found themselves unable to provide family medical histories. Survivors trying to establish legal documents found themselves unable to verify their places and dates of birth. Survivors trying to claim inheritance or citizenship rights found that the records that should have established their claims had been altered or destroyed. The administrative erasure that had been performed on them in childhood continued to have practical effects in their adult lives. For the many survivors who sought to reconnect with their families in Britain, the identity disruption created specific obstacles. A woman in her 50s trying to find the family she had been taken from at age 6 had to first establish who she had been before she could begin to trace who she was related to. If her name had been changed, if her birth date had been altered, if the records of her time in British institutional care had been destroyed or were held in a closed archive, the search could take years. Some searches failed entirely. People who had lived for decades with the belief that somewhere in Britain there was a family who might have wanted them died without finding out whether that was true. The organizations responsible for these record-keeping failures have, with varying degrees of willingness and completeness, engaged with the consequences of what was done. Some have opened their archives to survivors and to researchers. Others have been slower to acknowledge the extent of what their records contain and what their records conceal. The process of institutional accountability for the administrative harm done to these children has been ongoing for decades and is not yet complete. The concept of identity is something that people in stable circumstances take very much for granted. You know your name, you know your birthday, you know something about where you came from, the names of your parents, the place of your birth, the outline of your family history. These are not things you typically think about because they are simply there, available whenever you need them. For the children who were sent to Australia and who had their identities altered or suppressed, this ordinary certainty was not available. What other people take for granted as background was for them a question, an absence, a gap that no one would help them fill. The letters that never arrived constitute a specific chapter of this history that illuminates, more precisely than almost any other element, the deliberate nature of the separation that was imposed on the children and their families. Children who were sent to Australia and who wished to maintain contact with their families in Britain had, in most cases, only one route available to them: letters written by hand and given to the adults at their institution to post. This meant that the children's communication with the outside world passed through the hands of the very adults whose institutional interests were, in many cases, served by that communication not reaching its destination. The evidence that letters were systematically intercepted and destroyed, or simply never posted, comes from multiple sources. It comes from survivors who describe writing letters regularly and receiving no response, combined with later evidence that their families were searching for them throughout the period when the children believed they had been abandoned. It comes from families in Britain who describe writing to their children and receiving no response, combined with later evidence that the children had been writing letters that never arrived. It comes from the occasional institutional record that shows awareness of correspondence issues without any effort to address them. And it comes from the reunions that eventually took place, in which parents and children compared notes and discovered that they had each been writing to the other, unsuccessfully, for years. The effect of this suppression on the children was profound and lasting. A child who writes letters and receives no response begins, fairly quickly, to draw conclusions from the silence. The most natural conclusion, especially if the child has been told that the parent is dead or does not care, is that the silence confirms what they have been told. The letters were a form of hope, and the silence that responded to them was a form of progressive despair. Some children stopped writing, others continued for years, maintaining a one-sided correspondence that they did not know was one-sided. For the families in Britain, the silence operated in reverse, and it had its own distinctive anguish. A mother who had handed her child to a charity during a period of difficulty, who wrote to her child and received no response, had to live with that silence. She could not know, in most cases, whether the letter had failed to arrive, whether the child had chosen not to respond, or whether something had happened to the child. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Some parents and siblings made physical attempts to trace the children. They turned up at the offices of the sending organizations in Britain. They wrote letters to Australian authorities. They engaged lawyers and welfare organizations and members of parliament. The responses they received were designed to deter further inquiry rather than to facilitate reunion. They were told the child was well and had settled in happily, and that contact would be disruptive. They were told the organization had no record of the child in question. They were told that the child would be in touch when they were ready. The courage of the families who kept trying despite these responses is one of the more remarkable aspects of this history. Parents who were told repeatedly that their inquiries were unnecessary or unwelcome, who received official letters designed to sound reassuring while saying nothing, who were dismissed and deflected by organizations with the resources and the authority to maintain their deflections, who continued anyway to search, deserve a specific recognition. Many of them were working-class people with limited resources and limited access to the official channels through which information was controlled. They were up against institutions backed by government funding and social respectability, and many of them kept trying anyway. The postal system that was supposed to connect children in Australia with their families in Britain was, in practice, a system that could be and was used to maintain and deepen separation. The technical availability of correspondence did not translate into actual correspondence, because the adults who controlled access to the postal system had interests that ran counter to the children's interests. The technology of connection was weaponized as a tool of disconnection, and the children and families who bore the consequences of that weaponization are still dealing with those consequences today. The Victorian child rescue movement that gave birth to the migration schemes had its own internal logic, and understanding that logic is essential to understanding how the schemes came to exist and how they were justified to the public that funded them. The middle decades of the 19th century in Britain were a period of intense social anxiety about the condition of the urban poor. The Industrial Revolution had driven vast numbers of people from rural areas into the cities, and those cities had grown faster than their infrastructure could support. The slums of London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow were places of genuine and severe deprivation, with overcrowding, poor sanitation, disease, and a level of child mortality that was visible and disturbing to the middle-class reformers who began to enter them in the latter half of the century. The response of those reformers was shaped by the social and moral assumptions of their era in ways that are both understandable and troubling. They believed that the poverty they saw was not simply a consequence of economic conditions, but was connected to moral failure. They believed that children born into poverty were at risk not only of material deprivation, but of moral contamination, of learning habits and values that would perpetuate the cycle of poverty into the next generation. And they believed that the most effective intervention was to remove children from the environment that was contaminating them, and to place them in a different environment, one that would instill the values and habits of productive citizenship. This framework, which historians sometimes call child rescue ideology, was not cynical. The people who held it genuinely believed that they were saving children. The Barnardo organization, named after its founder Thomas John Barnardo, operated from this framework. Barnardo himself was a man of genuine passionate concern for the children he encountered in the East End of London, and the organization he created did provide genuine material support to many thousands of children who would otherwise have had very little. But the framework also justified the removal of children from living parents, the suppression of family connections, and the dispatch of children to places their parents had not agreed to and could not follow. The concept of the child's best interests, which is the foundation of contemporary child welfare law, was present in the Victorian era but was applied through the lens of class and moral ideology in ways that made it a tool of family separation rather than family support. A child whose parents were poor was a child whose best interests pointed away from those parents, toward the middle-class institutions and eventually the distant territories where better values could be instilled. The child's emotional needs for parental connection, for continuity, for the specific knowledge of belonging to a specific family were not part of the calculus. The religious organizations that became the most active participants in the migration schemes operated from a related but distinct framework. For Catholic organizations in particular, the religious formation of children was paramount, and the migration schemes offered the opportunity to place Catholic children in Catholic institutions in a society that was itself Catholic in its dominant culture, rather than in the religiously mixed environment of mainland Britain. The Australian Catholic Church was an expanding institution in the early 20th century, building its network of schools and parishes and hospitals, and it needed workers and parishioners, and, in due course, a next generation. The child migrants supplied this need with an efficiency that straightforward immigration could not. The secular version of the framework emphasized national interest, specifically the interest of the British Empire in maintaining and expanding its population of white British settlers across its territories. The politicians and officials who supported the migration schemes in parliamentary debates and in government funding decisions used the language of population, of labor supply, of the development of the empire's potential. The children were, in this framing, a resource that was being well deployed. The fact that they had not been consulted about their deployment was as irrelevant to this argument as it would be to ask a coal seam for its opinion on being mined. The aging out of children from the institutional system is a chapter of this history that receives less attention than the period of institutional care itself. but it is equally important for understanding the long-term consequences of what was done. Children in the Australian institutions did not stay in the institutions indefinitely. Boys were typically placed in employment in their mid-teens, on farms, in trades, in domestic service for the more presentable ones. Girls were placed in domestic service, typically with middle-class families in the cities and suburbs of the Australian east and west coasts. The placement was arranged by the institution, usually without meaningful input from the child, and the terms of the placement were determined by the institution and the employer rather than by the child. What happened to these children when they left the institution and entered the workforce was the first test of what the institutional preparation had actually equipped them for. The results were mixed. Some children had received enough practical training that they were able to perform the work expected of them competently, and they found employers who treated them reasonably, and they built lives that were functional if constrained. Others emerged from their institutions so poorly prepared for independent life, so socially underdeveloped, so lacking in the basic life skills that most young people acquire gradually through family life, that the transition to employment was a crisis rather than a development. The social isolation that accompanied the transition was particularly difficult. Young people who had grown up in institutions had, in most cases, no family network to draw on. They did not have an aunt who could take them in if the employment placement went badly. They did not have parents who could advise them about workplace difficulties. They did not have cousins or siblings nearby who could provide the informal support network that makes early adult life manageable. They had themselves, and whatever they had managed to build from the material of their institutional experience. Some young people, on leaving the institutions, made immediate attempts to find family. Boys who had been told their parents were dead and who had quietly doubted this their entire childhood sometimes used their first independent access to postal services to write to addresses in Britain they only half remembered, or to welfare organizations they had heard of by indirect routes, trying to establish whether anyone they belonged to was still alive. Some of these letters produced results, many did not. The organizations they wrote to were often the same organizations that had sent them to Australia, and those organizations were not uniformly helpful in responding to inquiries from people who had grown up and were no longer under their control. The working lives of former child migrants followed patterns that were in many ways predictable from the circumstances of their institutional preparation. Those who had been trained for farm labor worked on farms. Those who had been trained for domestic service worked in domestic service. The narrow vocational preparation they had received became the narrow range of their adult opportunities. The latter that might have allowed them to move beyond those initial placements through education or through professional development was not generally available to people who had received minimal formal schooling and who had no family support to fall back on during a period of retraining. Some former child migrants did build genuinely successful and satisfying lives through a combination of personal resourcefulness, good fortune, and the specific kindness of particular employers or community members who recognized their situation and provided extra support. These success stories are real and they matter, both for the individuals involved and for the historical record. But they should not be allowed to obscure the structural situation in which all former child migrants found themselves. Isolated, poorly documented, minimally educated, and without the family connections that provide most young people with their most fundamental resources for adult life. The comparative dimension of the migration schemes, specifically the fact that children were also sent to Canada, Rhodesia, New Zealand, and South Africa under related programs, is worth addressing because it confirms that the Australian experience was not an aberration, but an expression of a broader imperial policy. The Canadian dimension is, in numerical terms, actually larger than the Australian one. Estimates suggest that approximately 100,000 children were sent to Canada from Britain between roughly 1869 and 1939, primarily as agricultural and domestic workers. The schemes to Canada have their own organizations, their own histories, their own survivor communities, and their own ongoing processes of acknowledgement and reckoning. The children sent to Canada are sometimes called home children, a term that refers to the various British children's homes from which they were recruited, and the term has been adopted by the Canadian survivor community as a marker of shared identity and shared experience. The experiences of children sent to Canada shared many features with those of children sent to Australia. The same suppression of family connection, the same identity disruption, the same use as agricultural and domestic labor, the same inadequate oversight, and in many cases the same pattern of physical and in some cases sexual abuse. The geographical context was different, Canada being closer to Britain and sharing a land border with the United States. But the structural conditions of the children's situation were similar. The Rhodesian schemes, which were smaller in scale, involved children sent to what is now Zimbabwe to work on farms in the colonial agricultural economy. The racial context of Rhodesia added a specific dimension to the story of the children sent there, who were placed in a society organized around racial hierarchy and who grew up with the assumptions and experiences of the colonial settler class. Whether or not those assumptions served them well when the political landscape of that society changed after independence. The New Zealand schemes were smaller still, but followed the same basic pattern. And in South Africa, children sent under various schemes entered a society that was, in the 20th century, increasingly shaped by the apartheid policies that would formalize racial segregation and that placed British settler children in a specific and historically charged position. The common thread across all of these programs is the imperial logic that underwrote them. Britain had surplus children, the empire had labor needs and population needs. The children could be used to meet those needs. The consent of the children, the welfare of the children, the family connections of the children, were subordinate to the logic of imperial resource management. The children were the empire's most exploitable human asset because they were the cheapest, the most malleable, and the least able to resist. The comparative perspective also illuminates the specific features of the Australian experience that made it particularly significant. Australia was the largest single destination. It was the destination most directly shaped by the White Australia policy. It was the destination where the Catholic institutions were most powerful and where the institutional abuse was most severe and most extensively documented. And it is the destination where the reckoning through the Senate inquiry and the apologies has been most formally developed. The Australian story is the fullest version of a story that was being told simultaneously in multiple countries, and that fullness makes it the most useful lens through which to understand the broader phenomenon. The media's role in bringing the child migration schemes to public attention is a history within the history, and it illustrates something important about how hidden injustices reach the public consciousness and what conditions make that possible. The migration schemes had been the subject of occasional journalism throughout their history. There were British newspapers in the 19th and early 20th centuries that reported critically on aspects of the schemes, that raised questions about the welfare of the children being sent abroad, that published accounts from parents who had been separated from their children. These reports did not have the impact that later journalism would have, in part because the institutional forces opposed to investigation were powerful, and in part because the documentary record was not yet available to journalists in the way it later became. The shift that made sustained, effective journalism about the schemes possible came in the late 1980s and 1990s, when the combination of Margaret Humphreys' advocacy work, the growing survivor community in Australia, and changes in the media environment created conditions in which the story could be told in a way that reached a mass audience and could not be dismissed. The publication of Empty Cradles in 1994 was a catalyst. The book was reviewed widely, was taken seriously by serious publications, and was adapted for television in a way that brought the material to an audience that would not have read the book. The television adaptation, titled Oranges and Sunshine, was not made until 2010, but the story it told had been in public circulation since the book's publication. The gap between the book's publication and the film's production is itself interesting. It took 16 years for the story to find its way onto cinema screens, and the reasons for that delay are partly about the film industry's commercial calculations, and partly about the degree to which the story was still considered too difficult, too uncomfortable, too damaging to established institutions to be fully embraced by mainstream media. The Australian media's engagement with the child migration story deepened significantly during and after the Senate inquiry of 2001. The testimony presented to the inquiry was dramatic, incredible, and specific. It named organizations and individuals. It described experiences that were difficult to read without strong emotional responses. The media coverage of the inquiry was substantial and sustained, and it created a public context in which the organizations and governments involved could no longer maintain the silence that had served them for so long. The role of the internet in the survivor community's development is also worth noting. From the late 1990s onward, the internet provided child migrant survivors with a tool for finding each other, for sharing information, for coordinating advocacy, and for reaching journalists and researchers that had not previously been available to them. People who had been isolated in different parts of Australia or who had returned to Britain and were searching for connections could find each other online in ways that bypassed the institutional gatekeepers who had previously controlled access to information about the schemes. The legal dimension of the child migration story has been less prominent in the public narrative than the political and social dimensions, but it represents an important ongoing thread in the accountability process. Individual survivors and survivor groups have pursued legal claims against organisations and governments in both Britain and Australia, with varying degrees of success. The legal landscape for these claims has been complicated by questions of limitation periods, by the difficulty of establishing individual liability for institutional policies, by the deaths of many potential defendants, and by the destruction of records that might have supported specific claims. The courts in both countries have had to grapple with the question of how to apply contemporary standards of child welfare to conduct that occurred under different legal and social frameworks. The redress schemes that were established in both Australia and the United Kingdom in the wake of the apologies represented an acknowledgement that individual legal claims were not going to provide adequate or accessible remedies for most survivors. These schemes offered financial payments, usually relatively modest, in exchange for participation in a process of acknowledgement and support. The adequacy of the payments offered under these schemes has been consistently criticized by survivor advocates as insufficient relative to the severity and duration of the harm that the survivors had experienced. The institutional apologies made by religious organizations to the survivors of abuse in their institutions are a separate layer of the legal and moral accountability process. The Christian Brothers, the Sisters of Mercy, and other organizations that ran institutions in Australia where abuse occurred have issued formal apologies, and in some cases have contributed to compensation funds. The terms of these apologies and contributions have been negotiated through processes that involve survivor representatives, advocacy organizations, and legal advisors, and the outcomes have been welcomed by some survivors as meaningful and criticized by others as inadequate. The question of what adequate accountability looks like when the institutional structures that caused harm no longer exist in the same form, when the individuals most directly responsible are dead, and when the survivors are elderly and their needs are specific and urgent, is one that does not have a simple answer. The accountability process has been, and continues to be, an imperfect approximation of justice that is better than nothing but falls short of what the survivors deserved. The relationship between the child migration schemes and other contemporaneous policies of forced family separation in Australia deserves acknowledgement, because placing the schemes in that broader context illuminates both the specific harm they caused and the larger pattern of which they were a part. The stolen generations, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who were removed from their families under various state and federal policies throughout much of the 20th century, represent the most extensive and most damaging example of state-sanctioned forced family separation in Australian history. The parallels between the experience of the stolen generations and the experience of the British child migrants are numerous, and have been noted by historians and advocates on both sides: the removal of children from families without consent or with coerced consent, the suppression of cultural and family identity, the placement in institutional care or with families of a different background, the use of deceptive practices to maintain separation, the long-term psychological damage, the difficulty of reunion, the eventual official acknowledgement. The differences are also important and should not be obscured. The Stolen Generations policy had an explicit racial dimension, targeting Aboriginal children specifically because of their Aboriginality, with the stated aim in many cases of eliminating Aboriginal culture and identity over time. The child migration schemes targeted children on the basis of class and vulnerability rather than race. The context of colonialism in which the Stolen Generations policy operated added a dimension of cultural destruction that the migration schemes, damaging as they were, did not carry in the same way. But the fact that Australia in the 20th century was a society that considered it acceptable to remove children from their families on a large scale, under government authority, and to place them in institutions or alternative family structures with inadequate oversight is not coincidental. It is the expression of a set of social assumptions about children, families, class, race, and state authority that were embedded in the institutions and practices of the era. The British child migrants arrived in a society that was already, in its treatment of its own First Nations children, demonstrating the limits of its commitment to the welfare of the most vulnerable. The national apologies of 2008 and 2009, delivered by Kevin Rudd to the Stolen Generations and to the child migrants respectively, represented an attempt to acknowledge both aspects of this history and to begin, in both cases, the long process of repair. The fact that the apologies were delivered by the same Prime Minister in the same parliamentary term, less than 2 years apart, was not coincidental. It was a statement about the character of the country's history and about the government's commitment to engaging honestly with that history. The contemporary relevance of the child migration history extends beyond its value as a historical record and touches on questions about how governments and institutions treat the most vulnerable people in their care that remain live and contested today. The frameworks of child welfare that exist in Britain and Australia in the 21st century are substantially more protective than those that enabled the migration schemes. The legal recognition of children's rights, the establishment of independent oversight bodies, the development of professional standards for social work, the legal requirement to consider the child's best interests in all decisions affecting them, and the recognition of the long-term damage caused by institutional care relative to family placement, all represent genuine progress from the conditions that made the migration schemes possible. But the history also provides a warning about the conditions under which institutional harm can be sustained against vulnerable populations without effective check. The elements that enabled the migration schemes to continue for as long as they did without adequate accountability include the trust placed in organizations with both financial and ideological interests in the status quo, the inadequacy of oversight mechanisms that were dependent on the honesty of the institutions being overseen, the absence of effective voice for the people most directly affected, the social and political distance between decision makers and the children whose lives were being determined, and the cultural assumptions that discounted the inner lives and rights of children from certain backgrounds. None of these conditions is so historically specific that they cannot recur in different forms in different contexts. The trust placed in institutions, the inadequacy of oversight, the voicelessness of those most affected, the distance between decision makers and the affected, the cultural discounting of certain lives. These are not features of a past era. They are features of institutional power that require constant vigilance and consistent accountability to prevent from reproducing themselves. The child migration survivors who spent decades being disbelieved, being told their experiences were exaggerated or misremembered or simply irrelevant, who fought for recognition against the full weight of institutional resistance, who eventually won that recognition through sustained, organized, evidence-based advocacy, offer a model for how that accountability can be achieved. It is not a comfortable model because it requires accepting that the comfortable assumptions of institutional trustworthiness need to be challenged, and that the voices of the people with the least institutional power are often the voices most worth listening to. The river of this history, as was said at the beginning, runs long. It began in the charitable societies of Victorian England, and it flows through the sun-bleached institutions of Western Australia, and through the parliamentary chambers of Canberra and London, and through the offices of the Child Migrants Trust in Nottingham, and into the living rooms and care homes of the elderly survivors who are still here, still carrying what was done to them, still deserving of the world's attention and care. It does not end. It widens and it deepens and it carries in its current all the individual lives that were changed by what was done, and all the lives that flow from those lives, generation after generation, into a future that is still being shaped by a past that has not yet been fully reckoned with. The daily texture of life inside the institutions is something that the large-scale historical narrative tends to smooth over, and restoring that texture matters because it is in the daily texture that the specific character of a childhood is formed, or deformed. A child at Bindoon in 1950 woke to a bell. The bell was absolute. It determined when you rose, when you ate, when you worked, when you prayed, when you slept. There was no aspect of the day that was self-directed, no pocket of time that belonged to the child rather than to the institution. The schedule was the institution's way of expressing its authority over every hour of the day, and it was enforced with the same mechanisms that enforced everything else: punishments for lateness, for noise at the wrong time, for any deviation from the routine. Meals were institutional in the way that institutional meals have always been. Adequate in the sense that they kept children alive and working, inadequate in the sense that they bore no relationship to the food that children were built for emotionally and culturally. Children who had grown up in Britain eating the food of the British working class were confronted, on arrival in Australia with entirely different foods in entirely different quantities, and the adaptation was not always straightforward. Some survivors remember specific foods with the intensity that attaches to first experiences. The first time they tasted something, the sensory specificity of a particular meal eaten in a particular place. Others remember only hunger, a generalized, persistent hunger that was never quite fully addressed. The dormitories where children slept were communal, with rows of beds and no private space. Privacy is something that humans need as a matter of psychological health, and its complete absence over years of institutional life leaves traces. Children who grow up without any private space, without the ability to be alone with their own thoughts, without the experience of a physical environment that belongs to them in any meaningful way, develop a relationship with space and solitude that tends toward either extreme, an inability to tolerate aloneness or an inability to tolerate closeness. The dormitory was an environment that formed children, and what it formed them toward was not autonomy and self-possession. The social relationships that develop between children in the institutions were sometimes the deepest relationships of those children's lives. Children who were placed in the same institution, who ate at the same table and slept in the same dormitory and worked in the same fields, formed bonds that were forged in shared adversity. For some, these institutional friendships were the closest they ever came to the experience of family. The adults in their lives were authority figures. The other children were companions, allies, sometimes the only source of kindness in an environment that was structurally indifferent to kindness. The loss of these friendships when children were dispersed from institutions into employment or into different settings was another layer of the accumulated losses that characterized the child migrant experience. A boy who had spent 5 years in the same institution as another boy, who had been through the same experiences with him, who had formed a friendship that was as close as brotherhood, would be separated from him when they both aged out of the institution and were sent to different farms or trades in different parts of the state. The separation was done administratively, without ceremony, and with no provision for continued contact. The boys might find each other again in later life, or they might not. Many did not. The specific experiences of children who arrived in Australia during the post-war period, roughly from 1945 to the late 1960s, deserve particular attention because this was the period when the schemes were most actively promoted by both governments, when the largest numbers of children were sent, and when the gap between the contemporary understanding of child welfare and the practices in the institutions was most stark and most indefensible. The post-war period in Britain was a time of significant social change. The welfare state was being built. The National Health Service was established in 1948. The Education Act of 1944 had created a system of secondary education for all children. The social safety net was expanding in ways that were, slowly but genuinely, reducing the conditions of dire poverty and family instability that had been the primary feeder for the child migration schemes. By the early 1950s, the argument that British children were better off in Australia than in Britain was already weakening as a matter of material fact, and yet the schemes continued. The organisations that had been built around child migration were invested in their continuation. The Australian government continued to value the population contribution. The British government continued to fund organisations that sent children abroad as a cheaper alternative to maintaining them in domestic institutional care. The momentum of the established system overcame the changing social conditions that should have led to its discontinuation. The children who were sent in the post-war period arrived in institutions that had been operating for decades and had established cultures that were, by that point, deeply entrenched. The new arrivals were inducted into those cultures in the same way that all previous arrivals had been, through the combination of routine, authority, and the management of information that made the institution the totality of the child's world. They did not know that the world outside the institution had changed significantly from the world in which the institution had been established. They did not know that in Britain, the social conditions that had produced the child migration schemes were being dismantled. They experienced the institution as the world. The post-war cohort of child migrants includes many of the most active and articulate participants in the survivor advocacy movement, partly because they are the youngest survivors, and therefore the ones most likely to still be living and active, and partly because they came of age in an era that was more conducive to the kind of public advocacy and survivor testimony that the accountability process required. They grew up with the vocabulary of rights, of welfare, of psychological trauma. in a way that earlier cohorts often did not, and they have used that vocabulary effectively in the public campaign for recognition. The contrast between the childhoods of post-war child migrants in Australia and the childhoods of their contemporaries who remained in Britain is striking. A child who stayed in Britain in 1952 grew up in a country that was building the NHS, expanding education, developing social housing, and gradually constructing a welfare state that took seriously the idea that the state owed its citizens basic support. A child who was sent to Australia in 1952 grew up in a labour institution where none of these developments reached. The same political moment that was improving life for British children who remained in Britain was leaving behind the British children who had been sent abroad. The question of how we remember historical injustices and what kind of commemoration does justice to the people who experience them is one that the child migration history raises in specific and challenging ways. The formal apologies from the Australian and British governments were one form of commemoration, public, political, and official. They placed the acknowledgement of the harm in the official record of both nations. But acknowledgement and commemoration are not the same thing, and the question of how the child migration experience is commemorated in the ongoing life of both societies is one that has not been fully resolved. In Australia, there are memorials to the child migrants in several locations, including a dedicated memorial in Perth that acknowledges the experience of those who were brought to Western Australia. The Australian Institute of Family Studies has published research on the long-term impacts of the schemes. Some state archives have developed specific programs to help survivors and their descendants access relevant records. These are meaningful contributions to commemoration, but they are not yet at the level of visibility and public consciousness that the scale of the history warrants. In Britain, the commemoration is less developed. The British public's awareness of the child migration schemes is not as high as the scale of the British contribution to those schemes would seem to require. The story of the schemes does not occupy a prominent place in public education about British history. The organisations that sent children abroad have issued apologies and in some cases have contributed to compensation funds, but the public acknowledgement of what those organisations did has not been fully integrated into the broader narrative of British social history. The role of education in ensuring that the history of the child migration schemes is known to future generations is something that survivor advocates have consistently emphasised. The survivors themselves are increasingly unable to tell their stories in person, and the work of teaching those stories to the people who come after them falls to educators, to archivists, to documentary filmmakers, to writers, and to anyone who chooses to spend time in serious engagement with this history. The digitization of records is making it possible for the first time for survivors and their descendants to access information about the schemes that was previously available only in physical archives. The national archives in both countries have made significant investments in this work. The organizations that operated the schemes have, with varying degrees of completeness, contributed their records to accessible repositories. The picture that is emerging from the aggregation of these records is more complete than any that has been available before, and it continues to expand as new material is identified and processed. The witness testimonies that exist, recorded in various formats over the past 3 decades, are an irreplaceable part of the historical record. The Senate inquiry testimony, the documentary film testimonies, the oral history projects conducted by researchers and advocacy organizations, the written memoirs published by individual survivors, all of these constitute a body of first-person witness account that is as important as the institutional records. The institutional records tell you what the organization said they did. The witness testimonies tell you what it was actually like. Both are necessary for a full historical picture, and both need to be preserved and made accessible. The spiritual and religious dimensions of the child migration experience are something that the historical narrative often addresses in terms of the organizations that perpetrated harm, but they are also something that the survivors themselves have engaged with in their own varied and personal ways. Many of the children who were sent to Australia under the Catholic schemes grew up in institutions where religious practice was central to daily life. They attended Mass, they learned the Catechism, they prayed at structured intervals through the day. For some, this religious formation was the most positive aspect of their institutional experience, providing a framework of meaning and a community of practice that offered some consolation in difficult circumstances. For others, the religious context of their abuse made that abuse particularly damaging, because it involved a betrayal of the spiritual authority that the institution had cultivated in them. The relationship of survivors with religious faith in adult life varies widely. Some survivors have maintained the faith of their upbringing and have found in it resources that have helped them process what they experienced. Others have rejected that faith entirely, finding it impossible to separate it from the institutional context in which it was deployed against them. Others occupy complicated positions in between, maintaining some relationship with spiritual life while refusing the institutional forms in which they first encountered it. The Church's own reckoning with its role in the child migration schemes has been a significant part of the broader accountability process. The apologies issued by the Christian Brothers and by other Catholic organizations have been received with mixed responses by survivors, reflecting both the genuine significance of institutional acknowledgement and the sense that acknowledgement alone is insufficient reparation for the scale of the harm. The process of institutional religious accountability that has been ongoing since the 1990s, in the context of both the child migration history and the broader history of institutional child sexual abuse in Catholic institutions worldwide, is one of the major moral and institutional stories of the contemporary era. The question of forgiveness, which is a specifically religious concept, but which also has secular psychological significance, is one that many survivors have engaged with in their own terms. Some survivors have described a process of what they call forgiveness, not in the sense of absolving the perpetrators of responsibility, but in the sense of releasing themselves from the ongoing burden of anger that the unresolved harm had imposed on them. Others have explicitly rejected the framework of forgiveness, arguing that forgiveness is something that must be earned through genuine accountability and reparation, and that the accountability and reparation provided have not been sufficient to warrant it. The spectrum of responses to these questions is itself testimony to the diversity of the survivor experience and to the inadequacy of any single narrative to capture what the migration schemes did to the people who went through them. The child migrants were not a single type of person. They were thousands of individual people, and their responses to what happened to them were as varied as the people themselves. The specific geography of Western Australia as the primary location of the most severe institutional abuse in the child migration history is worth examining, because geography is never simply a neutral background in stories like this. Western Australia in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s was a state of vast distances, sparse population, and a frontier culture that valued practical capability over formal education, and that was, by the standards of Eastern Australia, relatively isolated from the political and social currents of the major cities. The Catholic Church in Western Australia was a significant institutional force in a society that had fewer competing institutions than existed on the eastern seaboard, and its relationship with the state government was one of considerable mutual benefit. The institutions that the Christian Brothers operated in Western Australia were located, deliberately in some cases, in areas of the state that made them difficult to access for anyone without significant resources and transport. Bindoon was in the hills north of Perth. Tarden was in the wheat belt, hundreds of kilometres inland. The physical distance from the scrutiny of the larger society was part of the institutional design, whether or not it was explicitly intended as such. The result was that what happened in those institutions happened in conditions of near-total isolation from any external check. The Western Australian government's relationship with the Catholic institutions that housed child migrants was one of both dependency and deference. The institutions provided services, housing, education, and labour supply that the government valued and could not easily replicate through its own resources. The government provided funding and land and the flow of children that the institutions needed to function. The mutual interests of the parties created a relationship that was not conducive to the government exercising the kind of critical oversight that the welfare of the children required. When the abuse in the Western Australian Catholic institutions eventually became public, the response of the Western Australian government was initially resistant and then gradually more engaged. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which operated in Australia from 2013 to 2017, examined the Western Australian Catholic institutions in detail and produced findings that confirmed and extended what the Senate inquiry of 2001 had established. The Royal Commission's report is the most thorough examination of institutional child sexual abuse in Australian history, and the Western Australian Catholic child migrant institutions feature prominently in it. The city of Perth, which is the capital of Western Australia and which was the destination for many child migrants who were placed in domestic service after leaving the institutions, has a specific relationship with this history that is reflected in the city's commemoration efforts and in the concentration of survivor advocacy organizations that are based there. The child migration history is, in a significant sense, part of the story of Perth's development, embedded in the labour that built the institutions and the domestic work that kept the city's middle-class households functioning through the post-war decades. The children who tried to run away from the Australian institutions occupied a particularly painful position, because running away required a kind of audacity and desperation that most young children do not have access to, and because the consequences of being caught were severe enough to deter all but the most determined. The geography of many of the institutions made escape extremely difficult on practical grounds. Tardan, in the Western Australian wheat belt, was surrounded by agricultural land and was many kilometres from the nearest settlement. A boy who left Tardan on foot would need to walk for hours before reaching any alternative source of food or shelter, and he would do so in conditions, heat and dryness and unfamiliarity that were genuinely dangerous for someone who had grown up in Britain and was not experienced in Australian bush conditions. The isolation that the institutions chose for their physical locations was, whether deliberately or incidentally, also a highly effective system of containment. The children who did attempt to run away almost always failed. They were caught by the brothers or farm workers, or they returned of their own accord when hunger and fear made return seem better than continuing. The responses to these attempts varied by institution, but the consistent element was punishment. Children who tried to run away were beaten. In some cases, they were placed in isolation. In some cases, the punishment was designed to be visible to the other children as a deterrent. The community of children within the institutions had its own internal dynamics, with older children sometimes exercising authority over younger ones in ways that replicated the institutional power structure rather than opposing it. This meant that a child planning to run away could not easily share that plan with peers, because it was impossible to know whose loyalty lay where, and because a child who informed on a runaway attempt could expect rewards from the institution's authorities. The children who showed the most resistance, who found ways to refuse the institutional system at some level, faced a particularly concentrated form of institutional response. These were children who questioned, who talked back, who maintained some interior self that was not fully domesticated by the institution's demands. The institutions did not value this quality. They experienced it as insubordination, and they responded to it accordingly. Some of the most damaged survivors are those who were most clearly themselves in childhood and who paid the highest price for it. The few children who managed to escape and to stay away were in an extremely precarious position. They had no family in Australia. They had no documents establishing their identity. They were minors, which meant that any adult who found them had a legal obligation to report them to authorities. The authorities would return them to the institution from which they had come, unless there was a specific reason not to, which there almost never was. The system had no mechanism for responding to a child who said the institution was unsafe, other than returning the child to it. The story of runaway attempts is ultimately a story about the absence of alternatives rather than about individual failure. A child who ran away from Bindoon was not making a poor decision. They were making a rational response to an intolerable situation with the limited tools available to them. The fact that the tools were inadequate to the task was not a reflection on the children. It was a reflection on the degree to which the system had closed off every route that might have allowed a child to find safety. There are survivor accounts of children who made multiple escape attempts, who were caught and punished, and who tried again, who kept testing the boundaries of their containment, because something in them refused to accept that those boundaries were the final word on what was possible. These accounts are among the most quietly heroic in the literature of this history, because they describe a refusal to surrender that was maintained against very long odds without any external support by children who had been stripped of almost everything except the capacity to refuse. The organizations that operated the child migration schemes benefited from them in ways that went beyond the idealistic purposes they publicly proclaimed, and understanding those benefits helps explain why the schemes continued as long as they did, and why the organizations were so resistant to scrutiny. The financial structure of the schemes was such that the organizations received government funding from both Britain and Australia on a per-child basis. Each child who passed through an organization's system represented a unit of revenue. This created an incentive to maximize the flow of children through the system that was not necessarily aligned with the interests of the children themselves. An organization that received government funding for housing and feeding and training children had a financial interest in having as many children in its care as possible for as long as possible. The labor that children provided within the institutions also had direct economic value. The agricultural institutions were, in many cases, commercially productive operations. The crops grown, the livestock raised, and the land worked by the children and young people in these institutions generated income that partially offset the institution's operating costs. The domestic labor performed by girls within the institutions maintained the physical infrastructure of those institutions. The construction labor at Bindun produced buildings of lasting value. None of this labor was costed and compensated in the way that equivalent labor by adult workers would have been. The placement of children into domestic service also generated income and relationships. Organizations that placed children with employers in the wider community received fees and maintained relationships with the employing class that were socially and financially valuable. The children who were placed were, in effect, a product that the organization manufactured and distributed, and the value of that product accrued to the organization, not to the children. The social prestige that attached to running a large and visible charitable operation was also a significant benefit. The organizations that sent and received child migrants were seen, by the political and social mainstream of their time, as performing a public service. They appeared before parliamentary committees and received thanks and approval. Their leaders were awarded honors. They were invited to sit on boards and committees that shaped policy. This social capital was enormously valuable to religious organizations in particular, for whom public respectability was inseparable from their broader mission. The accountability mechanisms that might have checked these benefits were inadequate. The inspections were superficial. The children were not in a position to make effective complaints. The parents in Britain had been denied information and access. The political culture of the era was disposed to trust religious and charitable organizations rather than to scrutinize them. The result was a situation in which organizations with direct material and social interests in maintaining the status quo were also the organizations most responsible for the welfare of the children in their care, and the conflict of interest was never adequately addressed. The financial histories of some of the organizations involved in the migration schemes are, in themselves, a subject that warrants continued research. The combination of government funding, donated labor, donated land, and the income from placed children's work created balance sheets that have not been fully examined in relation to the ongoing advocacy of survivors for financial compensation. The question of what the organizations gained from the schemes, measured against what the children lost, has not been fully answered. The government officials on both sides of the world who knew what was happening and continued to support and fund the schemes are a crucial part of this history, because without governmental support, the schemes could not have operated at the scale and for the duration that they did. In Britain, the Home Office and the various local authority welfare departments that transferred children to the sending organizations had a direct operational relationship with those organizations. They were not passive observers of the process. They were active participants in it. They signed the legal instruments that transferred custody. They processed the paperwork that authorized emigration. They received the reports from Australia that described how the children were getting on, and they assessed those reports and used them to justify continued participation in the schemes. The reports that were sent back to Britain from Australia were, in most cases, positive. The organizations administering the Australian institutions had every incentive to present their operations favorably. They needed the continued flow of children and the continued government funding that came with them. The British officials who received these reports had limited ability to verify their accuracy and limited institutional incentive to try. The mental model within which they operated was that the schemes were beneficial, and incoming information was filtered through that model. The House of Commons had occasional debates about child migration that raised questions about the welfare of the children involved. Individual members of Parliament who had constituents who were searching for children, or who had received concerning accounts from returning migrants, sometimes pressed for more rigorous oversight. These efforts were not sustained and did not result in systemic change. The political culture of the era combined a residual imperial confidence in the value of populating the empire with a strong deference to established charitable organizations. In Australia, the federal and state governments were both directly involved. The Commonwealth government provided financial subsidies for each child brought into Australia under the approved schemes. State governments provided additional funding and, in some cases, land grants for the establishment of institutions. The federal government had immigration authority and could have used it to scrutinize the conditions in which child migrants were arriving and being housed. The state governments had child welfare authority and could have used it to impose standards on the institutions operating within their jurisdictions. Neither level of government did this consistently or effectively. The Commonwealth's interest was primarily in the immigration numbers, in the population growth that the schemes contributed to. The state governments had varying relationships with the institutions in their territories, and in Western Australia in particular, where the Catholic institutions were among the most powerful, there was a degree of political deference to the Church that complicated effective oversight. The federal government in Australia was aware, through its own records, of conditions in the institutions that should have prompted more rigorous intervention. Inspection reports that described inadequate educational provision, insufficient food, excessive labor demands on children, and other problems were filed and noted and, in many cases, resulted in nothing more consequential than a letter to the institution requesting improvement. The institutional pattern of presenting a clean face to inspectors, while maintaining normal operations behind it, was well established and well understood, and the government officials who accepted it bear a share of responsibility for having done so. The bureaucratic culture that enabled this failure of oversight was not unique to the child migration context. It was characteristic of a period in which government bodies and charitable organizations operated on the basis of mutual trust and shared assumptions, rather than on the basis of rigorous and independent verification. The failure to protect the children in the migration schemes was a specific expression of a broader failure of accountability that the 20th century was slowly, unevenly, and incompletely learning to address. The parents who searched for decades for children who had been taken from them represent one of the most quietly devastating dimensions of this history, because their search was largely invisible, conducted in private against institutional walls that were designed to remain impenetrable. The searching began, for many parents, almost immediately after the children were sent. A mother who had handed her child to a charity during a period of illness and had then recovered, who arrived at the institution to reclaim her child and was told the child had been sent to Australia, did not accept that verdict and move on. She wrote letters, she visited offices, she spoke to welfare workers and lawyers and members of parliament. She persisted in the way that parents persist when something has been taken from them that they know they should have, against the full weight of an institutional system that was designed to deflect her. The letters that these parents wrote, where they survive in archives, are among the most affecting documents in the history of the child migration schemes. They are usually formal in their language because their authors knew they needed to make themselves heard by official bodies and had learned to adopt the register that those bodies responded to. But the formality is thin over something much rawer. A mother writing to a charity to ask about her son for the fourth or fifth time, who phrases the inquiry as a polite administrative request, is a person in pain using the only vocabulary available to her. The responses that these parents received were almost uniformly designed to discourage further contact. They were told their children were well. They were told their children had settled happily. They were told that further contact would be disruptive to the child's adjustment. If they persisted, they might be told that the organization had no records of the child, or that the child had been placed in a family home, the details of which were confidential, or that the child was now an adult and had the right to privacy. Every response was a door closed. Every door closed required the parent to find another door. Some parents kept searching until they died without finding what they were looking for. They left behind, sometimes, notebooks with lists of organizations contacted and responses received. They left behind boxes of letters and photocopies and official forms. They left behind the evidence of sustained effort against a wall that never gave way. Their children, had they known about the search, would perhaps have found in it some comfort. Many of them never knew. They grew up believing their parents had abandoned them or were dead, when in fact their parents had spent years trying to find them. The siblings who were separated from each other during the migration process faced their own version of this search, with the added complication that they might not know where to look because neither party had reliable information about where the other had ended up. A boy sent to Bindoon and a girl sent to a Sisters of Mercy institution who had been taken from the same British family might not even know the other was in Australia. They might both believe the other was still in Britain. They might both believe the other had died. The searches that eventually united some of these siblings, when they happened, often revealed that the two had been living within relatively short distances of each other in Australia for decades, separated only by the wall of institutional silence that neither had known how to breach. The reunion stories that have been documented are not uniformly joyful, and understanding why they are not tells you a great deal about the nature of the losses that were involved. The simplest reunion story, the one that appears in press accounts and in the advocacy literature, is the one in which a parent and child who were separated decades earlier find each other through a search service, are reunited, and experience a moment of recognition and healing that makes sense of the intervening years. This kind of reunion does happen. It has happened many times. And the people who experience it describe it as something genuinely transformative, a restoration of something fundamental that they had not been fully able to grieve because they had not been fully able to accept its loss. But the more complicated reunion stories are perhaps more representative of the overall experience, and they illuminate most clearly what it means to lose someone during the period of development when the deepest formative relationships are established. A parent and child who are separated when the child is 5 and reunited when the child is 50 have both been through 50 years of separate history. The child is not the child that the parent remembers, and the parent is not the parent that the child imagined. The parent may have changed profoundly in ways the child has no frame of reference for. The child may carry anger or grief or a kind of numbness about the original separation that makes the reunion feel simultaneously necessary and strange. The expectations on both sides may have been shaped by decades of imagining, and the real people who show up to the reunion may not match the imagined versions. Some reunions revealed painful truths. Survivors who had spent their lives believing their parents had wanted them sometimes found, on reunion, that the true history was more complicated, that the consent to emigration, while given under pressure or through deception, had been given nonetheless, and that the parent had found a way to live with the decision. Some survivors found that their parents had had other children after them, had built lives and families that did not include a space for the returned migrant. The welcome was real, but the space was limited, and the survivor had to process the discovery that they had been replaced in a family narrative without ever having been given the chance to remain in it. The reunions that involved siblings were often particularly complex, because siblings who were separated young had no shared adult history and no shared adult context within which to rebuild a relationship. They had shared origins and usually some shared early memories, but they had developed into adults in entirely separate circumstances, and the people they had become were not necessarily compatible in the way that might have been hoped. Margaret Humphreys, who founded the Child Migrants Trust in 1987, and who has done more than anyone else to facilitate reunions between child migrants and their British families, has written and spoken extensively about the complexity of these reunions and about the need to approach them with professional care and adequate follow-up support. The reunion itself is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of a new and different set of challenges. The people involved need sustained support to navigate what the reunion opens up, and the provision of that support has not always matched the need. The children who were reunited with parents who then died shortly afterward faced a particular anguish. The reunion had happened, the connection had been established, and then it was cut off again, this time permanently, before it had time to develop into the relationship that the survivor had needed and sought. For some, this late and brief reunion was nevertheless something. Evidence that the parent had existed, that the family had been real, that the story had an ending that could be held. For others, the brevity of the reunion was its own form of grief, added to all the grief that had come before. The psychological damage inflicted on the children by the migration schemes and its persistence into adult life has been documented by researchers, clinicians, and survivor testimony in ways that are both remarkably consistent and remarkably varied, because the forms that lasting psychological harm takes are shaped by individual temperament and circumstance, even when their origins are shared. The most commonly reported long-term effect is a difficulty with trust and with intimate relationships. People who grew up in institutional care without stable parental figures, who experienced betrayal by the adults who were supposed to protect them, and who were told lies about their most fundamental identities and relationships, often find it difficult to allow themselves to depend on other people in the ways that adult intimacy requires. The therapeutic literature describes this in terms of attachment disruption. When the primary attachment relationships of childhood are severed or corrupted, the patterns of relating that develop in their place tend to be either avoidant, in which closeness itself becomes threatening, or anxious, in which closeness is desperately sought but never quite secured. The second major pattern is what might be described as a pervasive sense of unworthiness. Children who were told their parents did not want them, or who were treated as cheap labor and as recipients of punishment rather than care, develop internal working models of themselves as people who are not worthy of better treatment. These models are not conscious beliefs that can be corrected by reasoning. They are embodied patterns laid down during the formative years that shape how a person interprets events and relationships for the rest of their life. Depression and anxiety are reported at elevated rates by adult survivors of institutional care in general and by child migrant survivors in particular. The mechanisms are multiple. The chronic stress of institutional life, the disruption of identity, the experience of abuse, and the loss of family connections all contribute to a cumulative load that many people carry into adult life in ways that affect their functioning across all domains. The experience of discovering in adult life that one's entire childhood identity was a constructed fiction, that one had a different name and a different family and a different history than one had been told, is a specific kind of psychological crisis. The psychiatric concept of identity disruption captures some of what is involved, but does not fully account for the particular way in which the revelation of a falsified identity undermines the person's trust in their own knowledge of themselves. Many survivors describe having known, at some level, for much of their lives, that something was wrong with their story, that there were gaps and inconsistencies that they could not account for, that they had been told things that did not quite add up. The confirmation of this intuition, when it came, was simultaneously a relief and a devastation. The relief was in having external validation of an internal sense that had been dismissed or suppressed. The devastation was in the full understanding of the scope of what had been done to them and the length of time they had been living with its consequences without knowing what those consequences were or where they had come from. The intergenerational transmission of trauma from child migrant survivors to their children and grandchildren has received increasing attention from researchers in recent decades. Adults who grew up without stable attachment relationships and who develop the psychological patterns associated with that deprivation do not automatically cease to carry those patterns when they become parents. The ways in which the child migrant experience shaped the parenting of the survivors and the ways in which that parenting shaped the development of the next generation are part of the ongoing human cost of what was done. The therapeutic approaches that have been most effective with survivors of childhood institutional abuse include specific modalities designed to address complex trauma. The kind of trauma that results not from a single catastrophic event, but from sustained, repetitive experiences of neglect, abuse, and identity violation in the context of relationships that should have been protective. The treatment of this kind of trauma is long and demanding and is not always available to the people who need it most, which means that many survivors have made their way through adult life without the specific support that their experiences warranted. The Australian Senate's Community Affairs References Committee conducted an inquiry into the child migration schemes in 2000 and 2001, and the report that resulted from that inquiry, titled Lost Innocence: Righting the Wrongs of Child Migration, stands as one of the most important official documents in the history of this issue. The inquiry was prompted, in part, by the advocacy work of Margaret Humphreys and the Child Migrants Trust, and in part by the growing body of survivor testimony that had accumulated over the previous decade. By the time the inquiry began, there was a sufficiently large and credible public record of abuse allegations and identity violations and family separations that it was no longer possible for either government to maintain that the schemes had been simply a well-intentioned program that had produced some unfortunate outcomes. The Senate inquiry heard testimony from survivors, from representatives of the organizations that had run the institutions, from academics, from welfare professionals, and from government officials. The testimony from survivors was, by many accounts, one of the most powerful and distressing elements of the inquiry process. People who had spent decades carrying experiences they had not been able to share publicly came before the committee and described what had happened to them in terms that were specific, detailed, and credible. The weight of consistent testimony across many individual accounts created a cumulative picture that was difficult to dismiss. The organizations that were called to account during the inquiry responded with varying degrees of openness and acknowledgement. Some had, by the time of the inquiry, already begun their own internal processes of acknowledgement and offered apologies and commitments to support survivors. Others were more defensive, emphasizing the genuine care that had been intended, the difficult circumstances of the era, and the standards of child welfare practice that had prevailed at the time. The committee's report made 74 recommendations, covering areas including acknowledgement and apology, access to records, support services for survivors, financial assistance, education, and the preservation of the historical record. The recommendations acknowledged both the severity of what had been done to the children and the ongoing nature of its consequences. They called for action from both the Australian and British governments and from the organisations that had operated the schemes. The report's conclusion that the children had been failed by the governments and organisations responsible for their care was unambiguous. Its language was measured, but its meaning was clear. What had been done was wrong. It had been known to be inadequate at the time by those responsible for oversight, and the failure to act adequately on that knowledge constituted a serious breach of public trust. The implementation of the recommendations that followed the inquiry was incomplete. Some recommendations were acted on promptly and effectively. Others were implemented partially or not at all. The financial assistance that was provided to survivors was, by many accounts, inadequate relative to the scale of what they had experienced. The access to records, while improved, was still obstructed in some cases by organizations that had not fully committed to transparency. But the inquiry itself was a landmark because it placed official acknowledgement of the scheme's failures on the public record in a way that could not subsequently be dismissed. The inquiry also produced something less tangible but equally important, a public acknowledgement that the survivors were telling the truth. For decades, the people who had been through the child migration system had existed in a kind of official limbo, their accounts considered insufficiently credible to warrant systematic investigation. The Senate's inquiry changed that. It said, on behalf of the Australian state, that these people had been wronged, that their testimony was credible, and that they were owed a response. That acknowledgement mattered to the many survivors who had spent years being disbelieved in ways that are difficult to overstate. Kevin Rudd's formal apology to the survivors of the child migration schemes, delivered in the Australian Parliament on 16th November 2009, was a moment that many survivors had waited for, in some cases, for their entire adult lives. Rudd had, earlier in his prime ministership, delivered the national apology to the stolen generations, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who had been removed from their families under separate but related policies. The framework of that apology and the public response to it created a context in which an apology to the child migrant survivors was both politically possible and publicly expected. The apology was delivered in formal parliamentary language, in the chamber that is the symbolic centre of Australian democratic life. Survivors who had travelled to Canberra for the occasion sat in the gallery and watched as the Prime Minister acknowledged, on behalf of the Australian government, that the child migration schemes had been wrong, that the children who had been brought to Australia under those schemes had been failed, that the treatment many of them had received had caused profound and lasting harm, and that the Australian government accepted a share of responsibility for that harm. For the survivors in the gallery, the response was often physical as much as emotional. People who had been told for decades, in various ways, that what had happened to them was either acceptable or their own fault heard from the head of government of their country, that what they had experienced was real and was wrong and was the government's responsibility. The validation was something that ordinary words do not quite capture. The apology was not universally welcomed without reservation. Some survivors expressed the view that an apology without adequate accompanying action was insufficient. They pointed to the gap between the rhetoric of the apology and the resources that had been committed to supporting survivors, to facilitating reunions, to opening records, and to providing the kind of sustained financial and therapeutic support that the scale of the harm required. Others raised the question of the British government's share of responsibility, noting that Australia could apologise for its role while Britain's role remained less publicly acknowledged. The children had been sent from Britain, under British legal authority, by British organisations funded in part with British government money. The Australian government had received them and housed them badly. Both failures were real, and an apology from one party while the other remained silent was, in the eyes of some survivors, an incomplete accounting. Still others responded to the apology with something more personal and more complicated, a grief that had been waiting for a specific permission before it could be fully expressed. People who had spent their lives managing a pain they did not fully understand, because they had no official validation that the pain was warranted, found that the official acknowledgement opened something in them that they had been keeping carefully contained. For these survivors, the apology was less a moment of closure than a moment of recognition that made it finally safe to feel the full weight of what they had been carrying. The apology was broadcast, and survivors in other parts of Australia who could not be in Canberra watched it from their homes, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of family or friends, sometimes in community gatherings organised by survivor support organisations. The reactions that were later reported covered a wide spectrum, from relief to anger to grief to a kind of exhausted satisfaction. The predominant response across that spectrum was the sense that something true had finally been said publicly, that had been known privately for a very long time. Gordon Brown's apology on behalf of the British government, delivered in February 2010, came several months after Kevin Rudd's Australian apology, and addressed the British dimension of the same history with a different set of emphases and a different set of political complexities. The British apology was delivered in a statement to the House of Commons rather than in a formal parliamentary ceremony, a difference in register that some survivors noted as significant. The statement acknowledged that the child migration schemes had caused harm, that children had been separated from their families, that the British government had a share of responsibility for what had happened, and that the government was sorry. The political context of the British apology was complex in ways that the Australian one was not. In Australia, the child migrants were a clearly identified group of people who had been brought to the country from elsewhere and who had experienced specific harms there. In Britain, the issue was more dispersed. The people who had been harmed were no longer in Britain, they were in Australia. They were not a voting constituency in any straightforward sense. And the organisations responsible for the sending were still functioning, respected institutions with political connections. The pressure for a British apology had come primarily from advocacy organisations and from individual survivors who had returned to Britain or who had maintained connections there, and that pressure had been sustained over many years. The advocacy work of the Child Migrants Trust and of survivor organisations was essential to making the British apology happen, because without sustained external pressure, the political will within government would not have been sufficient. The practical commitments that accompanied the British apology were, like the Australian ones, welcomed with some reservation by survivors and advocacy organisations. Funding was provided for the Child Migrants Trust to continue its reunification and support work. Commitments were made to improve access to records held by British institutions and government departments. The extent to which these commitments were honoured in full over the subsequent years has been a matter of continuing advocacy and monitoring. The question of financial compensation for survivors has been consistently raised in the context of both apologies and has not been fully resolved. The schemes operated for the best part of a century. The children who were sent through them were deprived of education, family connection, correct identity information, and in many cases subjected to physical and sexual abuse. The case for financial compensation, on the basis of the specific harms that are demonstrably attributable to the schemes, is one that the advocacy organisations have made repeatedly, and that the governments have addressed only partially. The historical responsibility that the British government bears for the child migration schemes is, in some respects, greater than that borne by the Australian government, because the schemes originated in Britain, were driven by British policy interests, and were administered by British organisations with British government funding. The Australian government's role was that of the recipient, the provider of the territory, and the partial funder of the institutions. The British government's role was that of the architect and the sender. An apology that acknowledges this asymmetry more fully than the 2010 statement did is something that survivor advocates have continued to seek. Margaret Humphreys and the organisation she founded, the Child Migrants Trust, deserve their own extended consideration in this history, because without the work that Humphreys began in 1987, the public reckoning with the child migration schemes might have come much later or might not have taken the form it did. Humphreys was a social worker in Nottingham when a woman walked into her office and told her she had been sent to Australia as a child, that she had been told her family in Britain was dead, and that she had recently discovered that her mother was alive. The woman was in her middle years. She needed help finding her family. Humphreys, who had no particular reason at that point to suspect that this case was anything other than an isolated administrative tragedy, began to investigate. What she found as she investigated was not an isolated case. She found thousands of cases. She found a pattern so consistent, operating across so many organizations and so many decades, that it could not be attributed to individual error or institutional incompetence. She found a system. She found that the system had involved both the British and Australian governments. She found that the children who had been sent through the system were now adults, scattered across Australia, many of them still carrying the identities they had been given on arrival, still believing the lies they had been told about their families, still separated from the people and the histories from which they had been severed. Humphreys published her account of this discovery in a book called Empty Cradles, which was published in 1994 and which was the catalyst for much of the public attention that subsequently focused on the issue. The book was both a personal narrative of her investigation and a systematic account of what the investigation had revealed. It was readable in a way that political reports and academic studies were not, and it reached an audience that would not otherwise have engaged with the material. The Child Migrants Trust, which Humphreys established to formalize and sustain the work of reunion and support, operates with the specific mandate of helping child migrants find their families and providing therapeutic support for the process. The Trust has facilitated thousands of reunions between child migrants and their families, and it has developed a specialized expertise in the particular psychological dimensions of this kind of search and reunion that draws on both professional therapeutic knowledge and the accumulated practical experience of decades of this work. The international dimension of the Trust's work deserves emphasis. The children who were sent to Australia came from across Britain, and they arrived in a country that was not Britain. The reunions that the Trust facilitates involve people on two sides of the world, separated by decades of separate history and by an ocean. The Trust has developed relationships with institutions and support services on both sides that allow it to provide coordinated support in a way that purely national organizations could not. Humphreys has received numerous honours for this work, including an OBE and an Order of Australia. But the honours are, in some ways, the least interesting part of the story. The more interesting part is the persistence and the depth of the inquiry that preceded them. Humphreys began her investigation at a time when the full scale of what had happened was not publicly known, when the organizations responsible were still powerful and resistant to scrutiny, when the political will to address the issue did not exist, and when the survivors themselves had not yet found a collective voice. That she continued, and that the work she did created the conditions for the advocacy and the inquiry and the apologies that followed, is a fact worth dwelling on. The story of the Child Migrants Trust is also a story about what sustained, professional, empathetic advocacy can accomplish over time. The Trust did not achieve its results quickly. The path from Humphreys' first encounter with a survivor in Nottingham in 1987 to the Senate inquiry of 2001 to the apologies of 2009 and 2010 was long and required sustained effort against substantial institutional resistance. The model of patient, evidence-based, survivor-centered advocacy that the Trust developed is one that has influenced the broader field of historical abuse accountability in ways that extend well beyond the specific context of the child migration schemes. The survivors who are still alive are elderly now, and the living memory of the child migration schemes is narrowing with each year that passes. The youngest people who were sent to Australia under the approved schemes would have arrived in the late 1960s. Before the schemes formally ended in 1970, and would now be in their 60s. Those who were sent in the earlier decades of the 20th century, if they are still living, are in their 80s and 90s. The diminishing living population of survivors gives a particular urgency to the work of documentation, commemoration, and support that continues to be done by organizations like the Child Migrants Trust, and by the researchers and archivists who maintain the historical record. The first-person accounts that exist are irreplaceable. They contain details of specific experiences, specific places, specific individuals, specific moments that no secondary account can fully reconstruct. Each survivor who dies without having had the opportunity to tell their story, or without having received the acknowledgement and support they needed, represents a loss that cannot be remedied. The survivors who have spoken publicly about their experiences have done so at significant personal cost. Telling a story like this requires confronting memories that many people spent decades trying to suppress. It requires submitting personal experiences to public scrutiny in ways that can feel exposing and risky. It requires trusting that the audience will listen and will believe, after a lifetime of institutional experiences that did not consistently reward either trust or truth-telling. The variety among the survivors is as important to acknowledge as the patterns they share. Not every child who was sent to Australia through these schemes had a terrible experience. Some found genuine kindness in their institutions. Some formed lasting friendships and built stable adult lives that were not irreparably damaged by what they had been through. Some have described their experience of emigration, in retrospect, as having opened opportunities that their circumstances in Britain might not have provided. These accounts do not cancel out the accounts of abuse and identity violation and family destruction. They exist alongside them as testimony to the complexity of what happened when you move hundreds of thousands of children through a massive, imperfectly supervised system over the course of a century. The children who had the best outcomes tended to be those who landed with individuals or in institutions that happened to be more humane, whose luck in the allocation process was better, who had personal resources of resilience that allowed them to adapt and build, and who eventually found access to the record that allowed them to understand what had happened to them. The children who had the worst outcomes tended to be those who were placed in the most abusive institutions, who were most completely isolated from any alternative to the institutional narrative, and who carried the weight of false identity and severed family connection for the longest before any support became available. The work that remains to be done includes not only the continued support of living survivors, but also the maintenance of an honest historical record, the preservation of archives, and the education of subsequent generations about what was done in their names by their governments and the charitable organizations their governments empowered. The child migration schemes were not a fringe aberration. They were public policy, funded by public money, implemented by respected institutions, and supported by the political and social mainstream of their era. Understanding how something like this can happen, and can continue happening for as long as it did, without being stopped, is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is part of the ongoing work of understanding how the people and institutions that wield authority over the most vulnerable manage to avoid accountability, and what it takes to make them face it. The river of this history runs long and wide, and its banks are still being mapped. The children who crossed the ocean, and who built their lives on the other side, with whatever they had and whatever they could make of it, deserve not only the apologies that were given, but the continued attention and care of the countries that sent them, and of everyone who is now the beneficiary of the civilization. Those children helped to build in a country that was not theirs, and that they were given no choice about coming to. Their story is the history of two nations. It belongs to all of us. If you have stayed with this story to the end, you have spent a long time in the company of something that deserves that time. The history of the British child migration schemes is not an easy thing to sit with, but it is a real thing, and real things are worth understanding. There are survivors still searching for families. There are archives still being opened and catalogued. There are researchers still documenting the full scope of what happened. There are organizations still providing support to people who are still living with what was done to them 70 and 80 years ago. The past, in this case, has not passed. It is present in the lives of specific human beings who are still here, still carrying it, still deserving of attention and care. If you came to this video looking for something calm and steady to carry you through the night, I hope the steadiness of the telling has been some use, even as the content has been what it has been. The night has space for difficult things, held quietly. History does not get easier by being avoided. It gets easier, sometimes, by being heard. Thank you for watching. If this channel is something you want to support, subscribing helps more than you might think. And if this history has moved you, or if you want to know more, the Child Migrants Trust and the National Archives of both Australia and the United Kingdom have resources available. The records are there. The story is there. It is waiting to be found by anyone who wants to look for it. Sleep well. The archival work that historians, researchers, and advocacy organizations have done over the past 3 decades to reconstruct the history of the migration schemes from the institutional records that survive is, in itself, a story of methodological persistence and scholarly dedication that deserves acknowledgement. The records are scattered across multiple countries, multiple institutions, multiple formats, and multiple levels of accessibility. Some are in the National Archives in Kew, some are in the National Archives of Australia in Canberra, some are in the archives of individual states, some are in the archives of religious organizations that have been more or less forthcoming about their contents. Some are in the archives of secular charities that have similarly varying policies of accessibility. And some have been destroyed, either deliberately or through the ordinary attrition of time and institutional disorganization. The researchers who have worked through this material, matching institutional records against survivor testimony, reconstructing individual histories from fragments, building the aggregated picture of what the schemes actually did and how they actually operated, have produced a body of scholarship that is the foundation of everything that the public reckoning with this history has been able to achieve. Without their work, the Senate inquiry would have had less to work with. Without their work, the apologies would have been less informed. Without their work, the survivors would have had less external evidence with which to support the testimony of their own experience. The records that have been most valuable are often not the official ones, but the incidental ones. The letters that were written and not sent, or that were sent and somehow survived in someone's private archive. The inspection reports that noted, briefly and without follow-up, something that seemed out of place. The financial records that reveal the economic relationships between institutions and governments in ways that the official narrative obscured. The personal diaries and correspondence of the people who ran the institutions, which sometimes contain admissions and observations that the official records do not. These fragments, assembled together, produce a picture that is more complete than any individual source could provide. The ongoing nature of this archival work is important to emphasize. The history of the child migration schemes is not yet fully written. There are archives that have not been fully examined. There are records that have only recently become accessible. There are individual stories that have not yet been told. The work of documentation and historical analysis continues, and will continue for some years yet, and the picture it produces will become more complete and more accurate with each iteration. The people who do this work, the archivists and the historians and the social workers and the advocates, are part of the story of the child migration history in a way that deserves recognition. They are not simply documenting a past event. They are participating in the ongoing process by which a society comes to understand and take responsibility for what was done in its name. That process is never finished, but it is always, when it is being done carefully and honestly, worth doing. The friendships that formed between child migrants across different institutions, once survivors began finding each other in the 1980s and 1990s, became one of the quiet foundations of the accountability movement. People who had never met during their institutional years, who had been housed in different facilities in different states, who had aged out of the system and dispersed into the wider Australian workforce, discovered through the early survivor networks that their experiences had been more similar than their geographic separation would have suggested. The same patterns, the same lies, the same suppression of identity and family connection, the same inadequate education, the same physical and emotional deprivation, had been applied to all of them across different institutions in different decades. The recognition of that shared pattern, when it came, had a specific and important effect. It shifted the frame from individual misfortune to systemic wrongdoing. A person who believed their experience was their own bad luck or the consequence of a few bad adults in a specific institution was in a different psychological and political position from a person who understood that what had happened to them was policy, was funded, was deliberate, and was replicated across the entire network of schemes in the same essential form. The shift from individual to collective understanding is what made the survivor movement possible, and the movement is what made the inquiry and the apologies possible. Each step in the chain depended on the one before it, and the first step was people finding each other and beginning carefully and tentatively to compare notes. That comparison, carried out in community halls and welfare offices and through the early channels of the internet, was the beginning of the end of the silence that had protected the institutions for so long. It was the point at which the children who had been told they were alone discovered that they were not, and that discovery changed everything that followed.